Hey there, welcome back to Bedtime Story. I know many of you listen to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you settle in, I'd really love to hear where you're tuning in from. And if these stories have been keeping you company at night, leaving a like and subscribing would mean a lot. Now, let's relax, get cozy, take a slow breath, and begin. In this new story, true scary stories of growing up in Appalachia they never warned us about. The Appalachian mountain range contains thousands of square miles of dense forest and deep valleys that remain largely unexplored today. Many residents of these isolated communities prefer to avoid the high ridges and deep hollows when the sun goes down. Jacob Miller was a 25-year-old surveyor who graduated from a technical college in the year 2012. He accepted a contract to map the boundaries of a large timber property located in the heart of Logan County. His objective involved placing physical markers every 50 feet to define the limits of a future logging operation site. State records from 2015 indicate that the project was part of a larger economic development plan for the region. The valley known as Black Hollow earned its name because the steep mountain walls blocked the light for most day. Archived notes from the 1920s describe the area as a place where the air remains cold even in July. Jacob drove his heavy truck through several small towns where the locals watched him with a sense of quiet suspicion. He reached the end of a gravel road and parked his vehicle near a rusted gate that was locked shut. Reportedly, the local utility companies refused to service the hollow due to the frequent equipment failures and the rough terrain. Jacob checked his radio and noted that he was already losing the signal from the nearest tower in the city. State records mentioned that the last official residence in the hollow was a small homestead that burned in 1970. Dispatch logs from that year recorded a series of strange sightings by the fire crews who responded to the scene. Investigators never confirmed the cause of the fire, and the county file from 2009 noted the case closed. Some locals claimed that the fire was set intentionally to drive out a family that refused to sell their land. Records conflict regarding the names of the victims, but the stories of the tragedy persisted in the local folklore area. Jacob ignored the local legends and focused on the technical requirements of the surveying job he needed to finish today. The hike into the center of the hollow took over 2 hours because the undergrowth was thick with thorny vines. Jacob carried a heavy pack filled with iron pins and a sledgehammer along with his digital GPS tracking device unit. He noticed that the forest was strangely quiet, and even the common birds of West Virginia seemed to be absent. The ground was covered in a thick layer of damp leaves that muffled the sound of his heavy leather boots. He reached the first corner of the property and began searching for the original boundary marker from 1924. He found a rusted piece of metal protruding from the base of a massive oak tree that looked very ancient. Jacob set up his tripod and began the process of verifying the coordinates using the satellite data on his screen. He noticed that his GPS unit was fluctuating wildly and gave him readings that were several hundred feet off target. Reportedly, the geological composition of the Appalachian Mountains can sometimes interfere with electronic signals during the summer months here. He decided to rely on his compass and the physical descriptions found in the old county files for his work. A sudden sound of a heavy branch snapping nearby caused him to pause and reach for the bear spray on belt. He scanned the trees but saw nothing except for the swaying leaves and the shifting shadows of the deep forest. As he moved deeper into the hollow, he stumbled upon the remains of a log structure hidden behind some brush. The cabin was built in the style of the early 1900s with a stone chimney that was mostly collapsed. Archived notes from the Historical Society suggested that this was the site of a failed mining office from 2011. Jacob walked toward the open doorway and saw that the interior was filled with rotted furniture and old rusted cans. He saw a series of strange markings carved into the wooden doorframe that looked like a tally of days. Some locals claimed that a hermit lived in this cabin until his disappearance in the winter of 24. He stepped inside the cabin to escape a sudden downpour of rain that began to fall from the gray sky. The air inside smelled of damp earth and old coal smoke, which felt very oppressive in the small, cramped space. He found a handwritten ledger on the floor that contained names and dates from the year 2009. Dispatch logs from that period mentioned a search for a missing hiker who was last seen near this cabin site. Investigators never confirmed if the ledger belonged to the missing man or a squatter who was living in the woods. Jacob took a photo of the ledger and prepared to leave as the rain began to taper off outside now. A low humming sound began to vibrate through the walls of the cabin and caused Jacob to feel very nauseous. He recognized the sound as an acoustic anomaly often reported in deep valleys where the wind hits the rock faces. County records from 2016 include several testimonies from park rangers who experienced similar physical sensations in the area. Jacob walked back into the clearing and saw that his survey tripod had been knocked over on the wet ground. He was certain that he had been alone in the woods, but the damage to his equipment suggested otherwise today. He carefully inspected the area for tracks, but the damp leaves made it impossible to see any clear footprints there. He heard a sharp whistle coming from the ridge above the cabin that sounded exactly like a human signal call. Jacob shouted a greeting into the forest, but the only response was the rhythmic tapping of wood against a tree. Some archived notes from the regional forestry department mentioned that timber poachers used these signals to communicate with each other. He decided to pack his gear and move toward the secondary survey site located on the eastern slope of hill. The feeling of being watched intensified as he climbed the steep terrain and moved away from the old log cabin. He kept his head down and focused on the path while checking his watch every few minutes to track time. He found a series of deep trenches that were dug into the hillside and lined with heavy pieces of plastic. State records from 2003 mentioned that illegal excavations were common in areas with potential for gold or gems. Jacob saw fresh cigarette butts near the edge of the trench, which indicated that someone was here very recently today. He realized that he might be encroaching on an active illegal mining operation that was not authorized by the state. Reportedly, these groups can be very protective of their sites and often use intimidation to keep strangers away from area. He began to back away from the trenches while trying to remain as quiet as possible in the thick brush. He saw a small pile of personal items near a tree that included a pair of child shoes and glasses. The county file from 2009 mentioned that a family vanished from a nearby campsite without leaving a trace. Investigators never confirmed if the items were connected to the missing family or if they were just discarded mountain trash. Jacob felt a surge of adrenaline as he realized the danger of his situation in this remote part of Hollow. He turned to walk back the way he came and saw a figure standing silently on the trail ahead of. The person was wearing a heavy, dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured their face from his view. Jacob stopped and raised his hands to show that he was not a threat to the person on the trail. He explained that he was a surveyor for the state and was only here to map the boundaries of property. The figure did not respond and simply pointed toward the ridge before turning and walking back into the dense trees. Records conflict regarding the presence of any registered residents in this specific section of the Logan County forest land. Jacob waited for several minutes until he was sure the stranger was gone before he continued down the narrow path. He felt his heart racing in his chest as he realized how isolated he truly was from any outside help. The sun began to drop behind the mountain peaks and cast long and distorted shadows across the forest floor today. Jacob knew that he could not navigate the terrain in the dark and needed to find a safe place soon. He found a small rock overhang that offered some protection from the elements and the wind blowing from the north. He sat with his back against the stone and kept his flashlight off to avoid drawing attention to his location. Some locals claimed that the woods come alive at night, with sounds that have no logical explanation for the people. He heard a series of heavy thuds that sounded like someone was dropping large rocks into the deep valley below. He used his flashlight briefly to check his map and saw a trail that was not listed on any document. Archived notes from the 1950s mentioned a secret road used by moonshiners during the era of the Prohibition laws. He decided to follow the trail in the morning because it appeared to lead directly toward the main highway exit. The sound of a metallic scraping began again and seemed to be coming from the woods directly above his head. Jacob stayed awake for most of the night and listened to the strange noises that echoed through the dark hollow. He felt a deep sense of dread that he could not explain despite his professional training and his personal experience. The first light of dawn revealed a heavy mist that clung to the trees and made visibility very difficult today. Jacob gathered his belongings and started walking down the secret trail while keeping a hand on his heavy survey equipment. He found a rusted metal sign that was nailed to a tree and written in a language he did not. Dispatch logs from 2012 recorded a similar report of a strange sign found by a group of local hikers. Investigators never confirmed the meaning of the sign and suggested it was a prank by some local high school students. Jacob reached a clearing and saw his truck parked in the distance, which gave him a great sense of relief. When he reached his vehicle, he saw that the tires had been slashed and the windshield was smashed with rocks. He checked the interior of the truck and found that nothing was stolen, including his expensive laptop and his radio. Reportedly, the act of vandalism was a clear warning to leave the area and never return to the Black Hollow. He used his satellite phone to call for help and waited for the local police to arrive at his location. State records from 2015 show that the police response was delayed by several hours due to a fallen tree. Jacob sat on the ground and watched the forest with a sense of defeat as the rain began to fall. Two officers from the Logan County Sheriff Department arrived in a heavy four-wheel drive vehicle to help him today. They took a statement from Jacob and examined the damage to his truck with a look of bored and indifference. The county file from 2009 mentioned that vandalism was common in the remote parts of the mountain range. Jacob told them about the cabin and the figure he saw on the trail, but the officers simply shook heads. Some locals claimed that the police were aware of the illegal activities in the hollow, but chose to ignore them. He felt that they were not telling him everything they knew about the history of the Black Hollow and its residents. The survey project was officially suspended by the timber company 2 weeks after Jacob returned to the main office today. State records from 2016 indicate that the land was sold to an anonymous buyer who requested no further maps. Jacob never received an explanation for the sudden change in plans, and he was assigned to a different project site. He still has the photos of the ledger and the strange markings he found on the door of the cabin. Investigators never confirmed any of his claims, and the case of the vanished family remains an open and cold file. He sometimes thinks about the figure on the trail and wonders if they were trying to help or to hurt. Jacob Miller moved out of West Virginia in the year 2017 to work in the flatter terrain of Ohio. He avoids the woods and the mountains because the sound of breaking branches still makes him feel very uneasy now. Archived notes from the local newspaper mentioned that several more sightings of the figure occurred in 2018 and 19. Records conflict regarding the current status of the Black Hollow, but many people say it is a cursed place today. Jacob knows that the truth is likely much more mundane, but no less terrifying than any ghost or monster story. The Appalachian Mountains will continue to keep their secrets hidden in the deep hollows and the shadows of the forest. Before Jacob entered the woods, he stopped at a small gas station to buy some water and some trail snacks. The elderly woman behind the counter saw his survey maps and warned him to be careful near the old creek. She mentioned that her grandfather used to work in the mines until the day he saw something in the dark. Reportedly, the man never spoke another word for the rest of his life and died in the year 1960. Jacob dismissed her story as a local superstition designed to frighten outsiders who came to work on the mountain today. He now realizes that the warning was based on a very real and present danger that he did not understand. The survey pins were made of galvanized steel and were designed to last for at least 100 years in soil. Jacob recorded the serial numbers of each pin in his logbook to ensure that the data was accurate and verifiable. County records from 2012 showed that many pins from the original 1924 survey were missing or moved. Some archive notes suggested that the movement of the earth was responsible for the displacement of the boundary markers there. Jacob found it hard to believe that nature could move a heavy steel rod several feet without leaving any tracks. He suspected that someone was moving the markers to change the size of the property for their own personal gain. Dispatch logs from 2015 recorded a call from a woman who lived on the edge of the Logan County. She claimed that her dog would bark at the trees for hours every night until it finally disappeared in June. Investigators never confirmed if a predator was responsible or if the dog had simply run away into the deep woods. Jacob thought about this report as he sat in his truck and waited for the police to arrive at site. He wondered if the figure he saw on the trail had anything to do with the disappearance of the local. The silence of the mountain felt like a heavy weight that was pressing down on his chest and his mind. There are many stories like this one that come from the heart of the Appalachian Mountains every single year now. Most of them are dismissed as urban legends or the result of too much isolation in the deep wilderness areas. State records and county files provide a glimpse into the reality of the events, but they never tell the whole. Jacob Miller still dreams of the metallic scraping sound and the feeling of eyes watching him from the dark trees. He will never return to the Black Hollow, and he advises others to stay away from the deep Appalachian woods. The truth remains hidden in the archives and the memories of the few people who were brave enough to enter. In this new story, true horror stories from a lonely February night drive. State records from 2024 document a sequence of unexplained events occurring along a desolate stretch of Highway 61. The Appalachian winter had settled into the deep valleys surrounding the small town of Montgomery, West Virginia during that cold month. Local dispatch logs indicate that the atmospheric conditions created a total loss of visibility for any driver venturing onto the road. Investigators noted that the combination of freezing rain and heavy fog made navigation nearly impossible for even the most experienced residents. These archived notes suggest that the environment played a significant role in the disappearance that would haunt the local community. 27-year-old Elias Thorne was a professional land surveyor who had been hired to evaluate a remote mountain property. His job required him to transport sensitive equipment that could not be left in his vehicle while he stayed at hotels. Records show that he preferred to travel during the early morning hours to avoid the congestion of heavy coal mining trucks. Thorne reportedly left his home in the middle of the night to ensure he reached his destination before the sun rose. County files from 2024 state that he had a clean driving record and no history of medical issues. The silver sedan, operated by Thorne, was seen passing a highway camera located near the outskirts of the town of Montgomery. Dispatch logs confirm that the vehicle was traveling at a consistent speed that matched the posted limits for the treacherous road. State records indicate that the car showed no signs of mechanical distress as it disappeared into the thick wall of fog. Investigators never confirmed if Thorne was aware of the black ice forming on the asphalt beneath his tires during that drive. Some locals claimed that the bridge over the Kanawha River was particularly dangerous due to the rising mist from the water. 40-year-old Marcus Vance was a veteran security guard working the graveyard shift at a restricted industrial gate near the highway. His primary responsibility was to log every vehicle that passed through the intersection to ensure the safety of the facility grounds. Vance reportedly noticed a pair of dim lights approaching through the darkness, but they seemed to flicker in an unusual pattern. Archive notes from 2024 suggest that the guard stepped out of his shack to get a better view. He later told investigators that the vehicle appeared to be coasting silently without any audible sound from the engine or tires. The security guard attempted to signal the driver with a high-powered flashlight to warn him about the upcoming road closure. Records conflict regarding whether the silver sedan actually slowed down or maintained its speed as it passed the security gate area. Vance stated in his official testimony that the windows of the car were completely covered in a thick layer of frost. This detail made it impossible for him to see the driver or determine if there was anyone else inside the vehicle. The county file from 2024 records his observation that the car left no tracks in the snow is less than #. Zero hash is greater than. 34-year-old Sarah Jenkins was an emergency medical technician who was finishing a long shift at the regional hospital. She was driving her ambulance back to the station when she encountered a figure standing in the middle of the lane. Jenkins reportedly slammed on her brakes to avoid a collision with the person who remained perfectly still in the freezing cold. State records show that she immediately contacted dispatch to report a pedestrian in distress on the isolated stretch of the highway. Her archived notes from that night described the individual as wearing clothing that was entirely inappropriate for the winter weather. The paramedic described the person as a tall man who was staring directly into the woods with a completely vacant expression. Investigators never confirmed the identity of this individual, despite conducting a thorough sweep of the surrounding area for several miles nearby. Jenkins stated that she did not exit her vehicle because the behavior of the man felt deeply unsettling to her. She waited for the arrival of local authorities while keeping her eyes fixed on the man through her clouded front windshield. Records from 2024 indicate that the figure simply vanished into the fog before the police could arrive. Search teams discovered the silver sedan approximately 2 hours after the initial report was filed by the concerned security guard and paramedic. The vehicle had left the roadway and come to rest against a cluster of pine trees near the bottom of a ravine. State records describe the scene as having very little physical evidence to explain why the car had veered off the road. Investigators noted that there were no skid marks on the pavement to suggest that the driver had attempted to use his brakes. The county file from 2024 confirms that the airbags had deployed upon the impact with the trees. The interior of the vehicle was remarkably orderly despite the force of the collision that had crushed the front bumper and hood. Archive notes indicate that the driver's side door was found in the locked position, which required the search team to brake. Thorne was not inside the car, and there was no blood or evidence of injury found on the seats or dashboard. Some locals claimed that they saw flashlights moving in the woods nearby, but the police found no other people on site. Investigators never confirmed if the windows had been rolled down or if they were shattered during the actual crash event. A detailed inventory of the vehicle was conducted by the county sheriff and recorded in the official file from 2024. Thorne's wallet was found resting on the center console with all of his identification cards and cash still tucked safely inside. His cell phone was plugged into the charger, but the screen was completely black and the device would not power on. State records show that his surveying equipment was still secured in the trunk and had not been touched by any outsiders. Investigators noted that his winter jacket was still draped over the back of the passenger seat in the cold car. The search for Elias Thorne expanded to include the entire region surrounding Highway 61 as more volunteers joined the effort. Dispatch logs show that canine units were brought in to track his scent from the driver's side door of the sedan. The dogs reportedly followed a trail that led directly to the edge of the Kanawha River before they stopped and barked. State records indicate that divers were sent into the freezing water to look for any sign of a body under the ice. These archived notes suggest that the river was too shallow in that specific area to sweep a person away quickly. Local residents began to share stories about other disappearances that had occurred near the same stretch of road over the past decades. Some locals claimed that the area was subject to magnetic interference that caused electronic devices to malfunction without any logical reason. Investigators never confirmed these theories and instead focused on the physical evidence found at the scene of the Thorne vehicle crash. Records conflict regarding the exact time that Thorne was last seen alive by anyone other than the security guard and paramedic. The county file from 2024 mentions a third witness who saw a man walking toward the old mines. A retired coal miner named Arthur Pringle claimed to have seen a man matching Thorne's description near the entrance of Shaft 4. Pringle reportedly told the police that the man was carrying a heavy metal lantern that emitted a very pale blue light. State records show that the old mine had been sealed with concrete blocks over 20 years ago to prevent any trespassing. Investigators checked the entrance and found that the seals were intact and there were no signs of any recent forced entry. These archive notes lead to further confusion regarding the timeline of Thorne's movements during that cold and lonely February night. 1 week after the disappearance, the Thorne family began receiving a series of mysterious phone calls that lasted for several minutes each. Dispatch logs indicate that the calls occurred at exactly 2 in the morning, which was the time Thorne was last seen. The family reported that the caller never spoke, but the background noise sounded like someone breathing heavily into the small microphone. State records show that the authorities attempted to trace the origin of the signals through the regional telecommunications network service provider. Investigators never confirmed the location of the caller because the signals seemed to jump between multiple different towers across the state. A breakthrough occurred when a technician found a record of a call originating from a payphone at a closed rest stop. Archive notes from 2024 described the location as an abandoned facility that had not been used in years. Police officers were dispatched to the rest stop where they found the handset of the payphone dangling by its metal cord. County files state that the area was covered in a layer of dust that showed no signs of any human footprints. Investigators noted that the payphone was not even connected to a functional phone line, according to the utility company records. While searching the rest stop, an officer discovered an old logbook that had been left on a wooden bench inside the building. The county file from 2024 indicates that the logbook contained names and dates from the early 1980s. One entry, dated February 14th of the current year, contained the name Elias Thorne written in very neat and precise handwriting. State records show that the ink was still wet when the officer touched the page to examine the mysterious written text. Investigators never confirmed how the name could have been written in a locked and abandoned building without any recent entry. As the weeks turned into months, the official investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne began to stall due to lack of evidence. State records indicate that every lead had been followed to a dead end without providing any clear answers about his fate. The silver sedan was eventually released to the family, but they refused to drive it because of the lingering cold smell. Some locals claimed that they still see a silver car parked on the shoulder of Highway 61 during the fog. Investigators never confirmed these sightings and dismissed them as the result of overactive imaginations within the small rural mountain town. The geology of the Appalachian region often creates hidden pockets of air and deep underground caverns that are not on any maps. State records suggest that the weight of the car on the unstable soil could have triggered a small and localized ground collapse. Investigators never confirmed if Thorne had accidentally stepped into a sinkhole that was hidden by the heavy layer of winter snow. Archive notes from the Geological Survey team mention that the area near the ravine has a history of sudden land subsidence. These factors remain part of the official theory, even though no physical opening in the earth was ever located by teams is less than #. Zero hash is greater than. Regional authorities conducted a final review of the dispatch logs to determine if any other vehicles had been in the area. County files from 2024 show that a black pickup truck was recorded entering the highway but never exiting. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the driver or the license plate because the video footage was too grainy to read. State records conflict on whether this truck was involved in the Thorne case or if it was just a local resident. This piece of data remains one of the many unanswered questions that continue to puzzle the lead detectives on the case. The Thorne family eventually placed a small memorial marker near the site where the silver sedan was found in the winter brush. Some locals claimed that the flowers placed at the memorial stay fresh even when the temperatures drop well below the freezing point. Investigators never confirmed the validity of these claims and viewed them as a way for the community to cope with loss. State records indicate that the case will remain categorized as an open investigation until some form of physical remains are located. The story of that night drive serves as a reminder of the mysteries that still exist in the mountains. The case of Elias Thorne remains one of the most baffling entries in the West Virginia State Archives from 2024. Regional records conflict on whether he was a victim of a crime or if he simply chose to walk away forever. The county file from 2024 is still marked as an active missing persons case with no new leads. Every February, the local dispatch logs see a spike in reports concerning a man standing in the fog near the river. Investigators never confirmed the source of these reports, but the mystery of that lonely night drive continues to persist today. In this new story, quiet California urban legends that people still whisper about at night. In 2022, state records from a coastal county in California detailed a series of strange occurrences involving hikers. Local authorities reportedly investigated multiple claims of unidentified figures moving through the dense fog during the early morning hours near Big Sur. These archived notes suggest that several individuals vanished without a trace while walking along the well-marked trails of the region. Investigators never confirmed any foul play, yet some locals claim that certain sections of the forest should remain completely avoided. The official dispatch logs indicate that search parties found only abandoned equipment left behind by the missing people during late autumn. Mark was a 34-year-old park ranger who worked specifically within the rugged terrain of the Central Coast. His daily job required him to monitor wildlife patterns and maintain the safety of the various trails used by seasonal tourists. He arrived at the remote observation station with the goal of documenting local coyote populations for a state-funded study. Records conflict regarding his exact location during the final hours of his shift before he failed to check in officially. The county file from 2009 mentions that no distress signal was ever received from his standard-issue radio equipment. Mark reportedly left his official vehicle parked at the trailhead with the engine still running and the driver door open. The search team discovered a set of footprints that appeared to lead directly into a solid wall of thick brush. Archive notes from the investigation describe how the tracks stopped abruptly, as if the person had simply vanished into thin air. State records indicate that the soil around the tracks showed no signs of a struggle or any other human presence. Investigators never confirmed if the footprints belonged to Mark or if another person had been walking in that specific area. The county file from 2009 remains one of the most puzzling cases for the local sheriff department to solve. Some locals claimed that they heard a metallic tapping sound coming from the canyon for several nights after he disappeared. Sarah was a 28-year-old freelance photographer who traveled to the area to capture the unique natural light. She spent most of her time near the cliff edges where the Pacific Ocean meets the rocky shoreline of Northern California. Her purpose for being in the location was to complete a series of images for a prestigious travel magazine project. Sarah reportedly told her friends that she felt a strange sensation of being watched while she was taking her photographs. State records show that her last social media post was a photo of the ocean taken at 4 in the afternoon. The image appears to show a dark shape standing just behind a cluster of trees on the edge of the cliff. Dispatch logs reveal that several residents called the police to report a woman screaming near the beach that same evening. Investigators never confirmed the source of the screams, and they found no evidence of any person being in distress there. Archive notes describe how her car was found, with the keys still in the ignition and her wallet on the seat. Some locals claimed that the coastal fog can play tricks on the ears and make the wind sound like human voices. State records from 2023 indicate that a commercial diver found a small piece of blue fabric near the rocks. This fabric reportedly matched the color of the jacket Sarah was wearing on the day that she was last seen alive. The small-town residents often speak about a third individual named David, who was a 40-year-old local historian. David spent many years collecting old maps of the Sierra Nevada mountains to find the location of the lost village. The county file from 2009 includes a map that he had hand-drawn with several red circles on it. State records show that he purchased a large amount of survival gear just 2 days before he left for his trip. Some locals claimed that David believed the lost village was protected by people who did not want to be found. Investigators never confirmed if he reached his destination, but they found his empty tent near a remote mountain stream. Archive notes mention that the tent was torn from the inside as if something was trying to get out quickly. A local rancher reportedly told the sheriff that he saw a group of men dressed in dark clothing near the stream. Dispatch logs from 2015 indicate that the rancher was considered a reliable witness by the local authorities at the time. State records show that the men were never identified and they seem to have no connection to the nearby towns. Records conflict regarding whether the men were carrying tools or if they were simply walking through the dense forest area. Investigators never confirmed if these men were related to the disappearance of David or the other missing hikers in California. The county file from 2009 mentions that several other historians had disappeared in the same region over decades. Some locals claimed that there are secret tunnels under the mountains that date back to the time of the gold rush. State records indicate that no such tunnels have ever been officially discovered by geologists or by any modern survey teams. Archived notes from 2012 describe a series of low-frequency vibrations that were recorded by seismic sensors in the area. Investigators never confirmed the cause of these vibrations, but they noted that the local wildlife became very agitated and loud. Records conflict on whether these events are linked to the urban legends that continue to haunt the rural coastal towns. Another report in the dispatch logs from 2019 describes a driver who claimed to see a transparent figure on Highway 1. The driver was a 50-year-old long-haul trucker who had been working the California routes for 20 years. He reportedly saw a person standing in the middle of the road during a heavy rainstorm near the Big Sur Bridge. State records show that he slammed on his brakes, but there was no impact and no body was ever found. Investigators never confirmed if the trucker was suffering from fatigue or if he truly saw something on the lonely road. Archived notes from the Highway Patrol mention that 3 other drivers reported the same figure during that specific weekend. Some locals claimed that the figure is a woman who vanished from a nearby resort during the summer of 1990. Records conflict regarding her name, but the county file from 2009 contains a missing person report from that era. State records indicate that she was a 42-year-old tourist from Oregon who was visiting the coast alone. Dispatch logs from 1990 show that her hotel room was left exactly as if she intended to return shortly. Investigators never confirmed any leads in her case, and the file was eventually moved to the cold case department for review. The archive notes mention that her footprints were found leading away from the resort and into the deep ocean water. In 2021, a group of researchers found a set of old keys buried in the sand near the cliffs. The county file from 2009 lists these keys as a possible match for a car owned by David. State records show that the keys were heavily corroded, but they still functioned when they were tested on a similar lock. Some locals claimed that finding the keys was a sign that the missing people are still present in the area. Investigators never confirmed this theory, and the keys were placed into an evidence locker for further study by forensic teams. Archived notes from the lab report indicate that there was no usable DNA found on the surface of the metal. Dispatch logs from the winter of 2024 mention a series of strange phone calls to the local police station. The callers reportedly heard nothing but heavy breathing and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks on the line. State records show that these calls were traced back to a phone booth that had been disconnected for 15 years. Investigators never confirmed how a disconnected phone could make outgoing calls to the emergency dispatch center during the middle of the night. Records conflict on whether this was a technical glitch in the aging phone system or a series of deliberate pranks. Some locals claimed that the calls always happen on the anniversary of the major disappearances in the coastal region. Archive notes from a retired sheriff detail his personal belief that the geography of California hides many secrets from the public. He reportedly spent his retirement years cataloging the various urban legends and mapping them against the official state records of incidents. The county file from 2009 contains a letter he wrote to the governor regarding the high number of cases. State records show that the governor never responded to the letter, and the sheriff passed away in 2021. Investigators never confirmed if his research had any merit or if he was simply an old man with too much time. Some locals claimed that his private journals were taken by men in dark suits after his funeral ended. Records conflict regarding the contents of those journals, but some believe they contained the truth about the missing people of California. Archived notes from a local librarian suggest that the sheriff had found a pattern in the dates of the disappearances. State records show that most of the events occur during the transition between the spring and the summer seasons each year. Dispatch logs from 2025 indicate that 2 more hikers have gone missing near the same coastal trail system. Investigators never confirmed if these new cases are related to the historical legends that have been told for many years. Some locals claimed that the forest is slowly expanding and reclaiming the land that was once occupied by the settlers. The county file from 2009 remains a primary source of information for those who seek to understand these events. State records will continue to document the facts, while the urban legends will continue to grow in the quiet coastal towns. Archived notes from the investigation suggest that the truth may never be fully known by the authorities or the public. Investigators never confirmed any supernatural activity, but the data they collected remains difficult to explain using only modern scientific methods. Records conflict on the final count of people who have vanished into the fog of the Northern California coastline. Some locals claimed that if you listen closely to the wind, you can still hear the voices of the missing. In this news story, true scary stories from quiet February nights. The rural outskirts of Blacksburg, Virginia, experienced an unusually silent stretch of weather during the first week of February 2020. Mark Henderson was a 45-year-old freelance archivist who lived alone in a renovated farmhouse located several miles from the nearest paved road. He moved to the region specifically for the isolation, which allowed him to process large volumes of historical documents without the distractions of city life. Local dispatch logs indicated that the area was under a stagnant high-pressure system, which resulted in nights that were remarkably still and devoid of wind. Mark spent his evenings working in a second-floor office that offered a panoramic view of the dormant fields and the dense tree line beyond the property fence. On the night of February 4th, Mark reportedly noticed a series of disturbances that did not align with the typical behavior of local woodland animals. He was reviewing a county file from 1984 when he heard a sharp metallic tapping sound originating from the exterior of the ground floor windows. State records from that month showed that temperatures remained well below freezing, which often caused the old timber frames of the house to contract and groan. However, the tapping followed a deliberate and repeating sequence that suggested a source with intent rather than a natural environmental shift. Mark remained in his office while the sound moved slowly from the kitchen windows toward the heavy oak door of the main entrance, is less than has-hone. 0 hash is greater than. Investigators later reviewed archived notes from a similar incident that occurred in a neighboring township during the winter of 2012. In that case, a resident claimed that an unidentified individual would stand in the shadows of the porch and tap on the glass with a small stone. County files from 2020 confirm that Mark contacted the local authorities at approximately 11 in the evening to report a potential trespasser on his land. The dispatch logs recorded that he was advised to stay inside and lock all access points until a patrol car could reach his remote location. Mark watched the security monitor in his office, but the infrared cameras showed no heat signatures or movement in the immediate vicinity of the porch. The patrol arrived 30 minutes later and conducted a thorough sweep of the perimeter using high-intensity spotlights to pierce the winter fog. State records indicate that the officers found a series of depressions in the frost that resembled human footprints, but they lacked any discernible tread pattern. Some locals claimed that certain individuals in the region practiced a form of stealth hunting where they wore heavy wool wrappings over their boots to muffle their movement. Investigators never confirmed this theory because the tracks abruptly ended at the edge of the gravel driveway without leading toward the road or the woods. The officers eventually cleared the scene after finding no signs of forced entry or physical damage to the property structure. By the following evening, the silence of the February night returned with an intensity that Mark described as being physically oppressive in his personal journals. He decided to install additional motion-activated lighting around the barn and the rear garden to deter any further unwanted visitors. Reported sightings of a pale figure standing near the tree line had been documented in archived notes from the previous decade, but were never substantiated with photographic evidence. As Mark was adjusting the settings on his laptop, he heard a faint vocalization that sounded like a person whispering his name from the hallway. He checked every room in the farmhouse, but found that he was entirely alone and all the windows remained securely latched from the inside. Records conflict regarding the frequency of these auditory anomalies, as some experts believe the layout of the valley can carry voices over several miles under specific atmospheric conditions. County file from 2009 mentioned that the mineral composition of the local bedrock could cause strange acoustic reflections during periods of extreme cold. Mark reportedly experienced a second night of tapping on the glass, but this time, the sounds originated from the second-floor windows, which were 20 feet above the ground. He retreated to the basement, where he spent the remainder of the night while monitoring the house through his internal security network. Dispatch logs from February 6th show that no further calls were placed by the resident, despite his documented history of reporting disturbances. When a delivery driver arrived at the farmhouse 3 days later, they found the front door standing wide open and the interior lights fully illuminated. State records noted that Mark's vehicle was still parked in the driveway and all of his personal belongings, including his wallet and phone, were found on the kitchen table. Investigators found archived notes in his office that detailed a timeline of the tapping sounds and the specific intervals at which they occurred. A search of the property and the surrounding woods was conducted over a 2-week period, but no trace of Mark Henderson was ever located by the teams. Some locals claimed that he had simply reached a breaking point with the isolation and chose to walk away from his life without a word. The official report remains open, and the house was eventually sold to a family from out of state who reported no unusual activity during their first year of residence. County files from 2022 indicate that the case was transferred to a cold case unit after all forensic leads were exhausted at the site. Investigators never confirmed if the tapping sounds were a prank, a natural phenomenon, or something more targeted toward the previous occupant. The events of that quiet February night serve as a reminder of how easily the silence of the rural landscape can be misunderstood. Mark Henderson remains on the list of missing persons, and the archived notes of his experience are the only evidence that anything unusual ever occurred. During the search of the basement level, investigators discovered a secondary county file from 1976 that had been moved from the upstairs office. This document described a series of disappearances in the Blacksburg area that occurred during the coldest weeks of February over several decades. State records indicated that none of these individuals were ever recovered, and their properties were often found with the doors left unlocked. The archive notes suggested that the incidents were linked by the presence of rhythmic tapping sounds reported by neighbors prior to the disappearances. Forensic teams examined the basement floor and found that the dust layers had been disturbed in a pattern that matched the movement of heavy furniture. No fingerprints other than those belonging to Mark were recovered from the metal filing cabinets or the basement windows. A local historian later provided dispatch logs from 1991 that detailed a similar event involving a retired teacher living in a nearby cabin. This individual had reportedly contacted the authorities to complain about a tall figure that appeared to be mimicking his daily routines from the tree line. Archive notes from the police department showed that the investigation was closed when the teacher moved to a different state without providing a forwarding address. Some locals claimed that the figure was a remnant of a settlement that had been abandoned during the 19th century due to a severe winter. Investigators never confirmed the existence of such a settlement, and the land records from that era remain largely incomplete. The connection between these historical events and the disappearance of Mark Henderson remains purely circumstantial according to state records. The forensic examination of the farmhouse windows revealed that the tapping had left microscopic fractures in the glass that were only visible under specialized lighting. The county file from 2021 noted that these fractures were consistent with a high-frequency vibration rather than a physical strike from a solid object. This data conflicted with Mark's original report of someone using a small stone to tap on the exterior of the house. Investigators searched the local power grid logs to see if a malfunctioning electrical transformer could have caused the vibrations, but the results were negative. State records indicate that the surrounding properties did not experience any similar glass damage or auditory disturbances during the month of February. The source of the energy required to create such precise fractures in the tempered glass remains unidentified by technical experts. The search for Mark Henderson was officially suspended in late March when the spring thaw began to saturate the low-lying areas of the property. Dispatch logs from the final day of the operation noted that the canine units were consistently drawn to a specific section of the limestone cliffs. Archived notes from the Geological Survey team mentioned that these cliffs contained several deep fissures that were not large enough for a person to enter. However, the dogs continued to alert on the openings until the handlers were forced to move them away due to the hazardous terrain. State records from that period show no evidence of human remains or clothing being found near the rock formations. The mystery of the quiet February nights in Blacksburg continues to be a subject of local speculation among those who remember the archivist. In the years following the disappearance, several hikers reported hearing rhythmic tapping while camping in the woods near the old Henderson farmhouse. The county file from 2024 recorded a statement from a group of students who claimed the sound followed them for several miles. Investigators never confirmed these reports, as the students were unable to provide a recording of the sounds or a specific location for the source. State records show that the forest in that region is now designated as a protected zone with limited access during the winter months. The archived notes from the Henderson case are still referenced by researchers interested in the acoustic anomalies of the Appalachian foothills. No further evidence has emerged to explain the events of February 2020, and the file remains in the state archives. The final entry in Mark's personal journal mentioned a feeling of intense cold that seemed to permeate the house despite the functioning heating system. He wrote that the silence outside was so absolute that he could hear the sound of his own heartbeat echoing through the walls. County files suggest that this psychological state is common among individuals experiencing long periods of extreme isolation in remote environments. However, the physical evidence of the footprints and the glass fractures continues to challenge the theory of a purely psychological event. Investigators never confirmed if Mark was aware of the 1976 file before he began experiencing the disturbances at the farmhouse. The story of the quiet February nights remains a cold case in the records of the Virginia State Police. In this new story, true horror stories from February road trips into Appalachia. The early morning mist clung to the jagged peaks of the Monongahela National Forest as Elias Thorne steered his sedan through the winding mountain passes. 2026 brought an unusually harsh winter to West Virginia, and the 28-year-old freelance photographer sought to document the frozen landscapes. He carried only a heavy parka and a high-end digital camera while aiming for the secluded ridges near the Randolph County line. The heater hummed against the biting chill of the February air as the asphalt gave way to a narrow gravel path. Thick pine trees crowded the shoulders of the road and limited his visibility to a few dozen feet in the gray light. Every mile deeper into the wilderness felt like a step further away from the safety of the modern world. State records from 2026 indicate that Thorne was reported missing by his sister 3 days after he failed to return. Local dispatch logs show that his vehicle was discovered abandoned on a Forest Service road with the driver's side door left wide open. Investigators found his camera on the passenger seat, but the memory card had been removed and was nowhere to be found. There were no signs of a struggle or any footprints in the thin layer of crusty snow surrounding the vehicle. Some locals claimed they heard a rhythmic metallic tapping coming from the woods that evening, but authorities never confirmed these reports. The silence of the Appalachian wilderness remained the only witness to the sudden disappearance of the young man from the roadside. County files from 2009 detail a similar occurrence involving a couple traveling through the same region during a winter storm. Sarah and Mark Miller were driving toward a remote cabin rental when their GPS reportedly began cycling through various conflicting sets of coordinates. The 30-year-old engineers were well prepared for the cold, but archived notes suggest they became disoriented near the Blackwater Falls. Search teams later located their SUV parked perfectly straight in the middle of a bridge with the engine still idling. All of their personal belongings, including wallets and cell phones, were neatly stacked on the dashboard in a precise vertical pile. Recovery efforts were hampered by the shifting terrain and the fact that various state records conflict regarding the exact find. A park ranger documented a series of archived notes regarding strange acoustic anomalies reported by hikers in the West Virginia highlands. These reports often describe the sound of a human voice mimicking the exact tone and cadence of a distress call. Investigators noted that these sounds were frequently heard near deep limestone caves where the acoustics can create deceptive or confusing auditory reflections. One specific entry from 2024 mentions a group of travelers who stopped their car because they heard a child crying. They followed the sound for several hundred yards into the brush before realizing the source was moving at an impossible speed. No evidence of a child or any other person was found in that sector during the subsequent law enforcement sweep. The mystery of the Appalachian road trips in February persists as more archived notes surface regarding these unexplained and cold cases. Forensic evidence often yields no biological traces or clues that would suggest the involvement of any known predatory mountain wildlife. Public records from the county level consistently show that these incidents occur during periods of high atmospheric pressure and low visibility. Families of the missing often wait for years while state records remain open and the official status of the files stays unresolved. The roads through the mountains stay quiet, and the high ridges of the forest continue to hold their secrets in silence. Travelers are simply advised to stay within their vehicles and keep their communication devices charged while traversing the lonely peaks. Another county file from 2012 recounts the story of a lone trucker named Julian who was delivering supplies to a town. He was 42 years old and had driven the same route through the mountains for over 15 years without any issues. On a Tuesday night in late February, he reported seeing a person standing in the middle of the road wearing a yellow raincoat. The figure did not move as the truck approached, and Julian was forced to slam on his brakes to avoid a collision. When he exited the cab to check on the individual, the road ahead was completely empty for several hundred yards. He reportedly checked his dash camera footage later, but the screen showed only static during the time of the supposed encounter. The archived notes from the local sheriff department describe how Julian refused to drive through that specific mountain pass ever again after that night. He claimed that the yellow raincoat was dry despite the heavy snow that was falling steadily throughout the entire evening. State records show that several other drivers had reported a similar figure in that exact location over the span of 3 decades. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the person, and no missing person reports from the area matched the description provided. Some locals claimed it was a trick of the light reflecting off the snow, but the dash camera failure remained unexplained. The incident remains listed as a miscellaneous anomaly in the county archives from 2012 with no further investigative leads followed. In 2018, a group of university students was conducting a geological survey near the border of Virginia and West Virginia. The 3 individuals were in their early 20s and had planned a 5-day expedition to study the local rock formations. According to dispatch logs, they checked in on the second night, but their final scheduled transmission was never received by the base. A massive search operation was launched involving multiple state agencies and local volunteers who combed the rugged terrain for weeks. They found the students' campsite completely intact, with their sleeping bags still laid out and a campfire that had burned out naturally. All of their high-tech geological equipment was left behind, including expensive sensors that were still recording data during the search. The recorded data from the sensors showed a massive spike in electromagnetic activity at the exact moment the final transmission was cut. Investigators could not explain why 3 healthy young adults would wander away from a warm camp without their shoes or jackets. Archive notes from the lead detective mentioned that the footprints leading away from the camp stopped abruptly after only 10 yards. It was as if the students had simply ceased to exist while walking toward the edge of a nearby steep ravine. Search dogs were unable to pick up a scent, and the aerial infrared scans showed no heat signatures in the vicinity. The case of the missing students from 2018 is still discussed by investigators who specialize in unusual wilderness disappearances. Reports from 2015 describe a phenomenon known among some locals as the phantom headlights of the Appalachian backroads. Drivers frequently reported being followed by a large vehicle with bright lights that would maintain a constant distance for several miles. Whenever the driver would pull over to let the vehicle pass, the headlights would instantly vanish into the darkness of the night. One county file from 2015 notes a driver who tried to outrun the lights and reach speeds over 90 miles. He eventually crashed into a guardrail, but dispatch logs indicate he was the only person on that road for 30 miles. The lights were never caught on any roadside cameras, and investigators never confirmed the existence of a second vehicle involved. State records show that these sightings are most common during the month of February when the mountain air is particularly dense and cold. Some investigators believe that atmospheric reflections of distant city lights could be responsible for the visual illusions experienced by the drivers. However, the frequency of these reports in areas with no direct line of sight to any major cities remains a conflict. Archive notes from a retired state trooper suggest that the lights always seem to appear near the sites of past accidents. No forensic evidence has ever been found to link these visual phenomena to any physical objects or known atmospheric conditions. The mystery of the phantom headlights remains a staple of local lore for those who travel through the Appalachian Heights. Records from 2006 document the case of a 35-year-old biologist named Clara who was studying winter hibernation patterns. She was traveling alone through the Greenbrier region when she reportedly made a frantic call to her husband from a satellite phone. Clara stated that she had found a cluster of abandoned vehicles deep in a valley where no roads actually existed. Investigators never confirmed the location of this valley despite extensive aerial surveys conducted in the following weeks after her disappearance. The satellite log showed the call originated from a coordinate point that was located inside a solid rock mountain face. Clara has not been seen since that day, and her vehicle was never recovered from the dense Appalachian forest floor. County files from 2022 mention a series of metallic containers found scattered across a remote ridge by a local hunter. The 39-year-old man reported that the containers were sealed and bore no markings or serial numbers of any kind. When federal investigators arrived at the scene 48 hours later, the ridge was completely empty and the soil appeared scorched. Some locals claimed they saw unmarked black helicopters operating in the area during the night, but official records conflict on this detail. Investigators never confirmed what was in the containers or who had placed them in such a difficult-to-reach location. The hunter reportedly moved out of the state shortly after the incident and refused to speak with any local journalists. Archived notes from a 2005 investigation highlight a recurring sound described by residents as the groaning of the mountains. This low-frequency vibration reportedly occurs only during the coldest weeks of February and can last for several hours at a time. State records indicate that seismographs in the region do not detect any tectonic activity during these specific windows of time. Some investigators suggest that the sound is caused by the freezing and expanding of water within the deep limestone cavern systems. However, the rhythmic nature of the sound led some locals to claim it sounded more like a mechanical process. The source of the groaning remains unknown and continues to be a point of debate among those who study Appalachian acoustics. In this news story, the Cumberland wilderness went silent, then we heard it. The dense forests of the Cumberland Gap hold a history of strange occurrences that the local authorities rarely discuss. Gideon Thorne had spent nearly 30 years patrolling the deep woods of the Cumberland wilderness near the quiet Kentucky border. The summer of 1997 was the hottest season on record, and the local wildlife had grown very restless. Gideon was 48 years old, and he oversaw a small team of rangers who focused on the southern ridges. His job required him to manage the safety of hikers who often underestimated the complexity of the ancient limestone caves. He carried a heavy radio and a notebook filled with the coordinates of every hidden spring in his large sector. A wildlife researcher named Beckett Sterling arrived at the ranger station during the first week of August to study birds. Beckett was 32 years old, and he specialized in bioacoustics, which is the study of natural forest sounds. He told the ranger he wanted to record the rare owls that lived in a remote valley called Blackwood Hollow. Gideon checked his permits and reminded the young man that the hollow was known for its unusually thick morning fog. Beckett just smiled, and he adjusted the straps on his large pack before heading toward the dark forest trail ahead. The ranger watched the researcher disappear into the tree line, and he felt a familiar weight of concern in chest. The first 5 days of the expedition passed without any major issues, and the weather remained remarkably clear and sunny. Beckett sent a brief radio check-in every evening at exactly 6 o'clock to confirm his location and safety. On the night of August the 6th, the radio remained silent, and Gideon could not reach the young man back. The ranger waited until the following morning before he organized a small search party to head into the Blackwood Hollow. They started their investigation at the last known coordinates that Beckett had provided during his final successful radio check-in. The searchers found the campsite tucked away in a grove of ancient hemlock trees that were covered in thick moss. The tent was still zipped shut, and all of the expensive recording equipment was sitting on a folding wooden table. Gideon noticed that the entire forest was eerily quiet, and not a single bird was singing in the morning light. There were no signs of a struggle, and the food supplies belonging to Beckett were still sealed in plastic bags. The search party expanded their perimeter, but they could not find any footprints or broken branches in the surrounding area. Gideon found a digital recorder that was still running, and he put on the headphones to listen to the print. The audio file started with the normal sounds of the forest, including the wind in the trees and distant owls. At exactly midnight on the recording, the woods went completely silent, as if someone had turned off a giant switch. The silence lasted for nearly 4 hours, and the only sound was the faint hum of the internal electronic components. Then a rhythmic tapping started to echo through the speakers, and it sounded like a person using a heavy hammer. Beckett could be heard whispering into his microphone about a large shadow that was moving through the trees near camp. He described a figure that was at least 8 feet tall, and it moved without making any sound on leaves. The researcher sounded terrified, and he said the creature was mimicking the sound of his own voice back to him. According to the recording, the being stood just outside the tent, and it repeated the exact words Beckett spoke. The final entry ended with a loud, metallic screech and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. Gideon felt a chill go down his spine as he realized that the researcher was not alone in Hollow. The search party spent the next 3 days scouring every inch of the valley, but they found absolutely nothing new. Gideon decided to review the archived dispatch logs from the early 1970s to see if this happened before then. He discovered that 3 other researchers had vanished in Blackwood Hollow under the exact same circumstances during the summer months. Each case involved a period of total forest silence, followed by reports of strange voices echoing through the limestone caves. Gideon realized that the hollow acted like a natural echo chamber that could capture and repeat sounds for many years. He returned to the campsite one last time, and he began to tap on the nearby rock walls with shovel. He heard a human voice whisper his name from deep within the stones, and it sounded exactly like Beckett Sterling. The ranger followed the sound toward a narrow opening in the cliff face that was hidden behind a thick waterfall. He squeezed through the gap, and he found himself in a large cavern that was filled with old recording gear. The equipment was decades old, and it had been carefully organized by someone who knew exactly how it all worked. Gideon found a final journal entry from a missing ranger who had disappeared in 1974 near the hollow. The writing described a group of beings who lived in the caves and used sound to hunt their human prey. These creatures could perfectly mimic the voices of loved ones to lure people away from their safe and marked trails. Gideon realized that Beckett had been tricked into following a voice that sounded like a friend calling for help. He saw a pile of bones in the corner of the cave that belonged to many different people, and the ranger managed to escape the cavern just as the rhythmic tapping started to echo through the dark stone walls. He ordered the entire Blackwood Hollow to be sealed off from the public, and he declared it a danger. The official report stated that Beckett Sterling had likely fallen into an unmarked sinkhole during a sudden and violent storm. Gideon knew the truth was much more unsettling because the mountain was still holding the voices of the lost hikers. He retired from the service a year later, and he moved to a quiet town where the ground was. The town of Blackwood tried to move on from the disappearance, but the residents never quite felt safe near the people started locking their doors at night, and they told their children to never repeat what they heard in woods. Gideon Thorne spent his remaining years studying the science of acoustics, and he tried to understand the mountain and its. He kept a copy of the final recording, and he often listened to the way the voice shifted and changed. Some people say that the observers are still out there, and they are still waiting for the next curious hiker. The legends of the Cumberland wilderness continue to grow, and more people report hearing voices in the high mountain air. Every August, the rangers notice an increase in the reports of rhythmic tapping coming from the deep limestone caves. They stay on the lower trails, and they never go into the hollow after the sun has set at. The case remains open in the dusty files of the sheriff's office, but no new evidence has been found. The forest remains thick, and the secrets of the Cumberland Gap are buried deep within the cold gray stone. Gideon often wondered if Beckett was still in the cave, and if he was still calling out for someone. He knew that some mysteries are better left alone in the dark corners of the world, where the wind. The investigation into the recording gear revealed that the machines had been modified with parts that were not commercially available. This discovery suggested that the beings in the caves possessed a high level of technical knowledge about sound and physics. Gideon realized that the creatures were not just animals, but were a highly evolved species that lived in the dark. He spent his final days writing a book about the experience, but he never shared the most terrifying details with. He died in 2024, and he left his collection of audio tapes to the local Historical Society archives. The researchers who studied the tapes found that the voices in the background were actually speaking a very old language. It appeared that the beings had been living in the Cumberland Gap for thousands of years before the settlers arrived. This realization changed the way the community viewed the mountains and the legends that had been told for generations. The mystery of the Cumberland silence remains unsolved, and the files are still locked in the ranger station basement. The town of Blackwood remains a quiet place, but the residents always listen closely when the woods go silent suddenly. They know that the mountain has a memory, and it never forgets a sound that it has heard before. Silas Thorne occasionally visits the old trailhead, and he leaves a small offering of electronics or metal on the rocks. He says it is a way to acknowledge the power of the mountain and its silent and ancient watchers. Some people laugh at him, but others bring their own gifts to the edge of the dark and thick forest. The hollow seems to accept these items, and the number of disappearances has decreased significantly over the last few years. Beckett Sterling is remembered as a brilliant researcher who pushed the boundaries of what we know about the natural. His family still visits the park every year, but they never go near the valley where he was lost. They stand on the high ridges, and they listen to the wind blowing through the trees of the Cumberland. Sometimes they hear a faint voice on the breeze, but they know better than to follow the sound into. The Appalachian Mountains continue to stand tall, and they keep their secrets hidden beneath the canopy of the green trees. The story of the silent wilderness is a reminder that we are only temporary guests in an ancient world. Gideon Thorne once wrote that the woods do not belong to us, but to the sounds that live within. Every October, the people look at the mountains and they remember the night the Cumberland wilderness went completely and eerily. The final recording Gideon made before he left the service was a simple description of the silence in the forest. He said that the silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence that felt very heavy and dark. He believed that the mountain was a living record of every scream and every laugh that had ever happened. This theory was never proven, but it remains a popular topic among the local hunters and the forest rangers. The tapes from the hollow are now stored in a specialized vault to prevent any unauthorized people from listening. Many people have tried to find the entrance to the hidden cavern, but the cliffs have shifted over the years. It seems as though the mountain has moved the path to protect its secret from the people who live. Silas Thorne says that some things are not meant to be mapped or understood by those who do not belong. He still patrols the lower trails, but he never goes above the ridgeline after the sun has set. He knows that the observers are still there, and they are still waiting for the next voice too. The legend of the Cumberland Silence is a chilling reminder of the power of the strange and the dark. The mountain remains a silent witness to the history of the land and the people who have passed through. Every year, the fog rolls into the hollow, and the woods go quiet once again for a long time. In this new story, West Virginia is not safe after midnight. The mountains of West Virginia are home to vast stretches of forest that many people find beautiful during the daylight hours. However, when the clock strikes 12, the landscape reportedly changes into something that feels entirely different and much more ominous today. Local residents often stay inside their homes because they don't want to encounter the silence that falls over the valleys. State records from 2022 indicate that several travelers vanished without a trace near the edge of the timberland. Investigators never confirmed what happened to these people, but the mystery continues to haunt the people who live in Greenbrier. The dense woods reportedly swallow the sounds of the night and leave only a heavy sense of dread for travelers. 24-year-old Ethan Miller worked as a regional delivery driver for a private logistics firm based in Charleston City. He was tasked with transporting a small crate of medical supplies to a remote clinic near the Monongahela National Forest area. Ethan had driven these routes many times, and he felt confident despite the heavy mist rolling over the dark asphalt. His goal was to complete the drop-off by 1 in the morning so he could return home to sleep. He didn't expect the navigation system to lose signal as he turned onto a narrow gravel path near the county. The trees seemed to lean over the road, and the high beams of his truck barely pierced the gray haze. The truck engine began to sputter and eventually stalled near a cluster of dead oaks that stood like jagged gray teeth. Ethan tried to restart the ignition several times, but the battery appeared to be completely drained for no apparent reason today. He checked his phone and found that the device was frozen on a screen displaying a distorted map of the region. Dispatch logs from that evening show no record of a distress call originating from his specific coordinates at that hour. He stepped out of the cab to check the engine and noticed a metallic scent hanging heavy in the cold air. The silence was absolute until he heard the distinct sound of something heavy moving through the dry leaves nearby tonight. County files from 2022 mention a series of conflicting testimonies regarding the presence of unauthorized camps in the area. Some locals claimed that they saw flickering lights deep in the woods that did not match any known park ranger equipment. Ethan reported seeing a tall figure standing perfectly still about 50 yards away from his stalled truck near the tree line. The figure didn't move or respond when he called out to ask for assistance with his dead vehicle battery today. He retreated into the cab and locked the doors while watching the shape through the cracked glass of his windshield. State police later noted that there were no footprints found in the mud where Ethan claimed the figure stood. The archived notes from the subsequent investigation describe a series of scratches found on the exterior panels of the delivery truck. These marks were vertical and deep enough to penetrate the paint down to the raw metal of the vehicle body tonight. Ethan stayed inside the cab for 4 hours until a passing motorist spotted him and called for emergency roadside assistance units. He told the responding officer that he felt as though he was being watched by multiple sets of eyes tonight. Investigators found several discarded items near the scene, including a rusted lantern and a tattered map from 2019 years. Records conflict regarding who owned those items or how long they had been laying in the tall grass area tonight. 31-year-old Sarah Jennings worked as a senior wildlife biologist for a research group based in Northern Virginia tonight. She was tasked with tracking the migration patterns of black bears across the dense thickets of the Monongahela National Forest. Sarah had spent hundreds of hours alone in the wilderness, and she felt comfortable navigating the steep terrain after sunset. Her goal was to retrieve data from 3 remote motion cameras that were located near a secluded creek bed tonight. She didn't expect the temperature to drop so rapidly as the heavy fog began to settle over the valley floor. The visibility decreased until she could only see a few feet in front of her high-powered tactical flashlight beam. State records from 2023 indicate that Sarah was reported missing by her colleagues after failing to check in tonight. Dispatch logs show that a search team was sent to her last known coordinates near the edge of the creek. Investigators reportedly found her research equipment scattered across the mossy ground, but her heavy winter coat was missing from sight. Some locals claimed that they heard a low humming sound echoing through the trees during the early morning hours tonight. State police never confirmed if the sound was related to the disappearance or if it was just a natural occurrence. Archived notes from the county file suggest that the area has a long history of unexplained electronic interference signals. A 52-year-old local sheriff named David Vance joined the search effort during the second night of the operation. He had lived in Greenbrier County his entire life, and he knew every ridge and hollow in the vast forest. David was tasked with interviewing residents of a small mountain community that lived near the northern border of the park. He wanted to determine if anyone had seen a lone woman walking along the high ridges after the sunset. He didn't expect to find a group of older residents who refused to leave their homes until the sun rose. They told the sheriff that the shadows in the forest reportedly behave in ways that do not follow physics. The county file from 2009 contains a detailed report about a similar incident that occurred in the same location. A group of hikers claimed that their compasses began to spin wildly while they were resting near the ancient rock today. They reported that the air became so thick that it felt like they were walking through water instead of mountain. Dispatch logs from that period show that the hikers were found huddled together in a small cave 3 miles away. Investigators never confirmed what caused the sudden disorientation or why the hikers had abandoned their heavy backpacks in the woods. Records conflict on whether the hikers were under the influence of any substances during their time in the wilderness area. State records from 2024 describe a discovery made by a hunter who was tracking a deer near the ridge. The hunter found a pair of hiking boots that were neatly placed on top of a large flat river stone today. These boots were identified as belonging to a man who had vanished from a nearby campsite in 2021 years. County files indicate that the laces were tied in a complex knot that the original owner did not know how. Some locals claimed that the boots appeared as though they had never been worn in the mud or the rain. Investigators never confirmed how the items remained in such perfect condition after spending 3 years in the harsh mountain. 47-year-old Thomas Reed was a land surveyor for a utility company in the city of Huntington tonight. He was tasked with mapping out a new power line corridor through the rugged terrain of Fayette County in October. Thomas had worked in the field for 2 decades, and he was known for his meticulous attention to every detail. He didn't expect to find a series of rusted iron stakes that were driven into the ground in a circle. Dispatch logs from 2023 show that he called his supervisor to report a strange feeling of being watched. Investigators never confirmed if there were any other people working in that specific area of the woods during week. State records indicate that Thomas was found 3 days later, sitting quietly inside his locked company truck near the state road. His equipment was still set up in the clearing, but the lenses on his expensive transit level were completely shattered. County files from 2023 describe how his clothes were perfectly dry despite the heavy rain that fell today. Thomas reportedly told the responding deputies that he saw a group of figures standing at the edge of the light. Records conflict on whether any footprints were found around the truck or if the ground was left completely undisturbed tonight. The sheriff noted that Thomas was unable to explain why he had removed the battery from his handheld radio. 19-year-old Clara Bennett was a student at a small college who decided to take a solo camping trip tonight. She was tasked with completing a photography project about the natural beauty of the New River Gorge region in spring. Clara had grown up hiking these trails, and she felt confident about her ability to handle the remote wilderness alone. Her goal was to capture the sunrise over the cliffs, but she arrived at the overlook much earlier than planned. She didn't expect the thick blanket of fog to rise from the river and swallow the entire canyon tonight. Archive notes from 2024 mention that her camera was found sitting on a rock with shutter open. Search and rescue teams reportedly spent 5 weeks scouring the steep cliffs and the turbulent waters of the river tonight. Dispatch logs from late May indicate that a local fisherman found a tattered yellow backpack snagged on a submerged tree. The pack was identified as belonging to Clara, but most of the contents inside were missing or damaged by water. Investigators never confirmed if she had fallen from the overlook or if she had walked away of her own. Records conflict regarding a set of blurry images found on the digital memory card that survived the long exposure tonight. Some locals claimed they saw a young woman walking along the highway, but the sightings were never officially verified. 68-year-old Elias Vance was a retired coal miner who spent his mornings fishing at the Plum Lake. He was tasked with managing a small cabin that belonged to his family for over 3 generations in the mountains. Elias had lived through many harsh winters, and he was not a man who was easily frightened by the woods. He didn't expect to find his heavy wooden front door standing wide open when he returned from the lake. State records from 2023 indicate that there was no sign of a forced entry into the cabin. County files mention that his bed was neatly made, but all of his shoes were missing from the closet. Dispatch logs show that a neighbor called for a welfare check after noticing that Elias had not started his stove. When the deputy arrived, he found a half-eaten meal on the table and the television was still playing softly. Investigators reportedly found a trail of bare footprints leading away from the cabin and into the thickest part of forest. These tracks were unusual because they were spaced very far apart, as if the person was running at full speed. Records conflict on whether the footprints belonged to Elias or if another person had been present at the cabin. State police never confirmed if they found any evidence of a struggle inside the home or in the yard. 35-year-old Officer James Miller was a state trooper who was patrolling a desolate stretch of Route 9. He was tasked with monitoring traffic near the border of the National Forest on a cold night in November tonight. James had served in the military, and he was a disciplined observer of his surroundings during his long night shift. He didn't expect to see a vintage car from the 1950s parked on the shoulder of the road. The vehicle appeared to be in pristine condition, and the engine was still warm to the touch of his. Dispatch logs from 2024 show that the license plate did not exist in any modern state database records. James reportedly walked toward the driver's side window, but he found that the interior of the car was completely empty. He checked the trunk and found a collection of old newspapers from 2009 that looked brand new tonight. State records indicate that the trooper returned to his patrol car to request backup, but his radio only produced static. Investigators never confirmed what happened to the vintage vehicle because it had vanished by the time the backup arrived. Records conflict on whether the dashcam footage showed the car or just an empty patch of the dark highway. Some locals claimed that the stretch of road was known for temporal anomalies that confused many of the older residents. Archived notes from a county file from 2009 describe a discovery made by a group of land surveyors. They were tasked with surveying a remote valley that had not been visited by humans for over 50 years tonight. The team found a small village of wooden cabins that were perfectly preserved beneath the canopy of the forest floor. They didn't expect to find the interiors of the buildings looking as though the occupants had just stepped out today. Tables were set with plates, and the wood stoves were still filled with ash from a fire long ago. State records indicate that there is no official record of a settlement ever existing in that specific remote location tonight. Some locals claim that the village belonged to a group of people who wanted to live away from society. Investigators never confirmed the identities of the former residents because they found no personal documents or letters in the cabins. Dispatch logs from 2023 show that a team of archaeologists was sent to examine the site today. They reported that the architecture did not match any known style from the Appalachian region during the 19th century. Records conflict on whether the village was built recently or if it had been standing for hundreds of years tonight. State records show that the site was mysteriously destroyed by a forest fire 2 weeks after the discovery. 42-year-old Dr. Helena Aris was a geologist who was studying the unique rock formations in the region. She was tasked with collecting samples from a deep limestone cavern that was discovered near the town of Romney today. Helena was an experienced climber, and she felt comfortable working in the dark and cramped spaces of the underground world. She didn't expect to find a series of rhythmic tapping sounds coming from deeper within the unexplored cave system. Her goal was to map the primary chamber, but she found herself drawn toward a narrow tunnel in the back. Archived notes from 2024 mentioned that her safety line was found cut with a very sharp tool. Rescue divers reportedly searched the flooded sections of the cavern for 12 days without finding any sign of the doctor. Dispatch logs from late October indicate that a team of cave experts found her helmet near a pool. The light on the helmet was still shining, and the battery was nearly full when they found the item. Investigators never confirmed how she could have disappeared from a chamber with only one way in and one out. Records conflict regarding a recording found on her handheld device that captured several minutes of heavy and irregular breathing. State records show that the cave was permanently sealed with concrete following the conclusion of the unsuccessful search effort. In this news story, a missing hiker case that changed a small West Virginia town forever. Small mountain communities often keep their secrets tucked away in the dense woods until a single person goes missing suddenly. The quiet town of Blackwood sat right on the edge of the Monongahela forest, where the trees grew very thick. Silas Thorne had worked as a lead ranger for the National Forest for over 25 years in West Virginia. He knew every single acre of the rugged land, and he respected the dangers that lived within the deep shadows. The autumn of 1994 brought a sudden cold snap that turned the green leaves into brittle brown shapes. A freelance cartographer named Elias Vance arrived in the town during the first week of October to map the ridge. Elias was 28 years old, and he had a reputation for being extremely thorough with his topographical surveys lately. He checked into the Pinecrest Motel and told the manager he would be back before the first heavy snow. Silas met the young man at the ranger station to provide him with the necessary permits for the backcountry. Elias carried a heavy pack filled with expensive survey equipment and enough food to last him for at least 10 days. He planned to hike toward a remote area known as Dead Man's Drop, which few people ever bothered to visit. Silas warned him that the weather could turn dangerous quickly, but Elias just smiled and said he liked the solitude. The young man seemed very confident in his abilities, and he possessed a map that was incredibly detailed and old. Silas watched the cartographer disappear into the tree line, and he felt a strange sense of unease in his chest. The first week of the expedition passed without any issues, and the weather remained remarkably clear and quite sunny for October. Elias was expected to return to the town by the 20th of the month to submit his preliminary survey findings. When the 21st of October arrived without any sign of the young man, the motel manager contacted the authorities. Silas organized a search party consisting of local volunteers and several experienced deputies from the nearby sheriff office in town. They started their investigation at the trailhead where the old blue truck belonging to Elias was still parked and abandoned. The vehicle was covered in a thick layer of pine needles, and the interior appeared to be completely undisturbed by anyone. Silas found a set of spare keys hidden in the wheel well, and he opened the door to check the glove box. Inside, he found a journal that contained several entries about the unusual geological features of the northern ridge and the cliffs. Elias wrote that the compass readings in the area near Dead Man's Drop were becoming increasingly erratic and very difficult. The search party began the long hike into the wilderness, while a light rain started to fall from the gray clouds. They followed the marked trail for 3 miles before they reached the point where Elias had planned to go off. Silas noticed that the undergrowth in this part of the forest was unusually thick, and it looked very dark indeed. The searchers moved in a grid pattern, and they shouted the name of the missing man into the cold mountain air. They found the first significant clue near a shallow creek about 5 miles into the dense and very unforgiving mountain brush. A bright orange survey marker was tied to a low branch, but it had been shredded by something with claws. Silas knelt down to examine the damp ground, and he noticed several deep impressions that did not look like footprints. These marks were elongated, and they seemed to sink deep into the mud, as if the creature was very heavy. The search party pushed deeper into the wilderness as the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon of peaks. They reached the base of Dead Man's Drop just as a light dusting of snow started to coat the ground. One of the volunteers shouted when he spotted a dark shape huddled beneath a natural rock overhang near the cliff. It was the heavy backpack that belonged to Elias Vance, but the young man was nowhere to be found nearby. Silas approached the pack with caution, and he noticed that the straps had been sliced with a very sharp blade. The contents of the bag were scattered across the frozen ground, and it looked like someone had been searching through. Silas gathered the items, and he found that most of the food was still inside and neatly wrapped in plastic. The most important discovery was a small handheld cassette recorder that Elias used to take notes while he was working. Silas pressed the play button and listened to the voice of the young man as it echoed through the air. The early recordings were standard descriptions of rock formations and elevation changes that sounded very professional and quite calm indeed. However, the tone of the voice changed significantly on the final entry, which was dated October the 14th of that year. Elias sounded breathless, and he whispered into the microphone about a cabin that was not supposed to be on maps. He described a structure made of gray stones that seemed to blend perfectly into the side of the steep mountain. According to the recording, the cabin had no windows and the heavy wooden door was sealed shut with iron bolts. Elias said he heard a rhythmic tapping coming from inside the stone walls that sounded like a person using hammers. He decided to wait nearby to see if anyone would come out of the strange building before the sun set. The recording ended abruptly with a loud metallic clatter and the sound of heavy boots running over very dry leaves. The search party spent the next 2 days looking for the stone cabin, but they found absolutely nothing in area. Silas studied the topographical maps and realized that the coordinates Elias mentioned led to a sheer cliff face with no ledge. He returned to the site where they found the backpack and began to clear away the snow with his hands. He discovered a series of narrow grooves carved into the rock that looked like they had been made by fingers. These grooves led toward a hidden crevice in the mountainside that was barely wide enough for a man to enter. Silas squeezed through the opening and found himself in a small, natural cavern that felt surprisingly warm despite the weather. The walls were covered in charcoal drawings of the surrounding forest and detailed maps of the town of Blackwood below. In the center of the cave sat a pile of survey equipment that had been smashed into hundreds of pieces. Silas found a final notebook page tucked into a crack in the stone wall that contained a single sentence. It stated that the mountain was not made of rock, but of something that was still breathing and hungry. The search for Elias Vance was officially called off after a massive blizzard buried the entire ridge under snow. Silas spent his final days as a ranger reviewing the dispatch logs from the night Elias recorded his final message. He discovered that several residents of Blackwood had reported hearing a strange rhythmic tapping coming from the floorboards of homes. These reports were dismissed at the time as settling foundations or the sound of woodpeckers in the nearby forest trees. Silas realized that the tapping Elias heard in the mountains was the same sound that was haunting the town below. He revisited the cavern one last time before he retired, but the entrance had been sealed by a rock slide. The maps that Elias had drawn on the cave walls suggested that the mountain was slowly expanding toward the town. Silas noticed that the distances between the trees near the trailhead were slightly different than they were 10 years ago. It seemed as though the earth itself was stretching and moving in a way that defied all known laws of. The disappearance of the young cartographer remained a cold case, and the files were eventually moved to a dusty basement. The town of Blackwood tried to move on from the tragedy, but the residents never quite felt safe in homes. Every year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, the local sheriff noticed an increase in reports of strange tapping sounds. The town of Blackwood was never the same after the disappearance of the young man who came to Map Wilderness. People started locking their doors at night, and parents told their children to stay away from the edge of woods. Silas Thorne retired from the ranger service a year later because he could not stop thinking about the rhythmic tapping. He moved to a different state, but he still kept a copy of the final recording in a desk. Some of the locals claimed they saw a figure watching the town from the high ridges during the cold months. These witnesses described a tall man who carried a survey pole and moved with a strange and very jerky gait. No body was ever recovered, and the stone cabin remained a mystery that the mountain refused to give up. The disappearance of Elias Vance became a local legend that served as a grim reminder of the power of nature. Some things are simply not meant to be mapped or understood by the people who live in the world. The Monongahela forest continues to grow over the old trails, and the secrets of the ridge remain buried in time. Silas often wondered if Elias was still out there somewhere tapping on the stones of a cabin that lived. He knew that some mysteries are better left alone in the dark corners of the world where the wind. The case remains open in the dusty files of the sheriff office, but no new evidence has ever been. Every October, the people of Blackwood remember the cartographer who vanished into the Gray Mountain, and they stay inside. The forest grew thicker around the old ranger station, and the trail to Dead Man's Drop was eventually closed forever. Silas occasionally received letters from old friends in Blackwood who claimed the mountain was appearing closer to the town center. They sent photographs of the horizon that showed the jagged peaks towering over the rooftops in a very threatening way. Silas looked at his old maps, and he realized that the town of Blackwood was no longer where it started. The entire valley had shifted several miles to the north, according to the latest satellite imagery and the local surveys. He remembered the charcoal drawings in the cave, and he realized that Elias had been trying to warn the town. The breathing that the cartographer mentioned was not a metaphor, but a literal description of the earth beneath their feet. Silas finally burned the final recording and the notebook page because the sound of the tapping was becoming too loud. He spent his remaining years in a quiet house far from the mountains where the ground was flat, and the mystery of the vanishing hiker remains one of the greatest unexplained events in the history of the small town. People still whisper about the man who tried to map the heart of the mountain and found something else. The stone cabin is still out there waiting for the next traveler to stumble upon its cold and windowless walls. In this new story. Real February horror stories from the hills of West Virginia. In the midwinter of 1979, a 31-year-old mother named Susan Roop lived in the small community of Shady Spring within the Appalachian foothills. According to reportedly archived notes, Susan was navigating a difficult divorce while managing a local bank position to support her 3 young children. Despite the stress of her personal life, Susan remained optimistic about her future after recently being awarded full custody and preparing for a property sale. The regional weather in February was notoriously harsh, yet Susan was seen by multiple witnesses performing her daily routines in the cold mountain air. Dispatch logs from the local county file from 2009 indicate that her morning started like any other Tuesday in the quiet town. On the morning of February 12th, Susan left her home and reportedly entered a late-model truck driven by an unidentified individual near the roadside. Records conflict regarding the driver's identity, but state records show that Susan's children were greeted later that day by their estranged father. He claimed to the children that their mother had simply abandoned them, though he later revised this statement to investigators during questioning. By the time a missing persons report was filed on February 14th, Susan had not returned to her bank job or her family. Investigators found it highly unusual for a woman with such deep ties to the local community to vanish without a single word. State records show that several letters written by Susan surfaced shortly after her disappearance, expressing a profound fear for her own physical safety. Some locals claimed that her house had burned down mysteriously just months prior to her vanishing, adding to the growing regional unease. Despite massive search efforts through the dense woods and rugged terrain of the West Virginia hills, no physical evidence was ever found. Law enforcement never confirmed any specific suspects, and the case of the young mother remained officially cold for several long decades. To this day, the remains of Susan Roop have never been recovered from the vast and silent Appalachian wilderness. Further south, in the rural region of Greenbrier County, investigators never confirmed the strange events surrounding a 1997 disappearance in the hills. A 40-year-old local mechanic named Ray was reportedly seen walking toward a clearing near the edge of the state forest during a blizzard. County files from 2009 suggest that Ray was an experienced woodsman who knew the dangers of the February cold. He had told neighbors he was looking for a stray calf, but archived notes indicate no livestock were missing from the farm. His tracks simply stopped at the base of a limestone cliff, leaving search parties with no direction to follow in the snow. Investigators noted that Ray's personal belongings were still inside his unlocked cabin, including his heavy winter coat and his loaded hunting rifle. Some locals claim to hear rhythmic metallic tapping coming from the woods for several nights following his sudden and unexplained disappearance. State records show that a search team found a single boot 5 miles away, but forensic analysis never confirmed it belonged to him. The case remains a source of conflict among researchers who believe the rugged terrain hides more than just natural hazards. Local legends often fill the gaps where official reports fail, but the factual evidence remains chillingly thin for those left behind. Within the same mountainous region, a third case from 1984 involves a young surveyor named David working near the New River. Reportedly, David was tasked with mapping a remote section of the hills before the heavy February ice made the steep slopes impassable. Dispatch logs from that period record a final radio transmission where David sounded calm but mentioned finding an unmarked concrete cellar. When he failed to return to the base camp by nightfall, a rescue team was dispatched to his last known coordinates. They found his surveying equipment neatly stacked on a flat rock, but David was nowhere to be found in the area. Archived notes from the sheriff's office mentioned that the concrete cellar David described was never located by any of the subsequent search teams. Investigators never confirmed if David had encountered someone in the woods or if he had simply become disoriented in the shifting mountain fog. Records conflict on whether he had any reason to leave his life behind, as he was engaged to be married. Some locals claimed that the area was historically avoided due to unstable ground, yet no sinkholes were discovered during the intensive search. His disappearance remains one of the many unsolved mysteries that haunt the cold winter history of the West Virginia Highlands. In February of 2011, a 35-year-old wildlife photographer named Sarah ventured into the Monongahela National Forest for a winter project. State records show that she was a seasoned hiker with professional-grade GPS equipment and enough supplies for a 3-day excursion. Reportedly, she checked in with a park ranger on the morning of February 3rd, stating her intention to photograph the frozen waterfalls. When her vehicle was found, still parked at the trailhead 5 days later, a full-scale search operation was initiated by the local authorities. Investigators never confirmed any signs of a struggle or foul play near her abandoned SUV, which was covered in thick snow. The county files from 2009 through 2020 detail the exhaustive efforts to locate any trace of Sarah's presence in the forest. Searchers reportedly found her camera tripod standing perfectly level in the middle of a frozen creek bed several miles from the trail. Archived notes describe the camera itself as missing from the mount, though the storage bag was found tucked inside a nearby hollow log. Some locals claim to see unusual lights in that specific sector of the woods during the week of her disappearance, but officials dismiss these reports. Records conflict on whether the tracks leading away from the tripod belonged to Sarah or to a large local predator. The investigative team noted that Sarah's GPS device was eventually recovered by a hiker in 2014, nearly 10 miles from her last known position. State records indicate that the device had been powered off manually and it contained no data points from the day she vanished. Some investigators suggested that Sarah might have intentionally disappeared, but her family maintained that she had no motive to leave her career. Dispatch logs from the recovery effort mentioned that the area where the device was found had been searched multiple times in previous years. The case remains open with no new leads, leaving Sarah's fate as cold as the February air in which she disappeared. In another documented incident from 1992, a 28-year-old truck driver named Mark was reported missing near the West Virginia border. Reportedly, Mark was hauling a shipment of timber through the winding mountain passes when his rig was found idling on the shoulder. Dispatch logs confirmed that the engine was still running and the heater was on full blast when state troopers arrived. Archived notes state that Mark's wallet and cigarettes were left on the dashboard, suggesting he had stepped out only for a moment. Investigators never confirmed any mechanical issues with the truck that would have required him to stop in such a remote location. State records show that bloodhounds were brought to the scene, but they refused to track any scent beyond the passenger side door. Some locals claimed that the stretch of highway was notorious for sudden whiteout conditions that could disorient even the most experienced drivers. County files from 2009 mentioned that a local resident reported seeing a man matching Mark's description walking along a ridgeline miles away. However, investigators never confirmed this sighting, and no physical evidence of Mark's passage through the woods was ever discovered. Records conflict on the timeline of events, as the truck had been stationary for at least 6 hours before the police arrived. The mystery of Mark's disappearance was further complicated when his wedding ring was found at a local gas station 3 weeks later. Investigators never confirmed how the ring got there, as the station was over 50 miles from where the truck was abandoned. Archived notes suggest the ring appeared to have been placed deliberately on a sink in the men's restroom rather than dropped. Some locals claimed this was a sign of a voluntary disappearance, while others believed it was a taunt from an unknown third party. To this day, the state records for Mark's case remain classified as a missing person investigation with no resolution in sight. Finally, in February of 2004, a 60-year-old retired schoolteacher named Eleanor vanished from her porch in the town of Fayetteville. Reportedly, Eleanor had been seen by a neighbor feeding the birds just moments before she was nowhere to be found. Dispatch logs show that her front door was left wide open and her tea was still steaming on the kitchen table. State records indicate that Eleanor had lived in the same house for 40 years and had no history of memory loss. Investigators never confirmed any evidence of a break-in or any signs that Eleanor had left the property of her own accord. Archived notes from the local sheriff mentioned that a series of strange phone calls had been placed to Eleanor's residence in the weeks prior. Some locals claimed these calls consisted only of heavy breathing and the sound of wind, though the records conflict on this detail. County files from 2009 reveal that a set of footprints was found in the light snow leading toward the back garden. The footprints were notably large and appeared to be made by someone wearing heavy work boots, yet they ended abruptly at the fence. Eleanor was never seen again, and the quiet hills of West Virginia kept yet another secret from the cold winter of 2004. In this news story, a Valentine's night no one ever forgot. The small town of Hinton sits quietly along the New River in the rugged mountains of southern West Virginia. On the evening of February 14, 2016, a local resident named Thomas Miller prepared for a simple night. He was a 32-year-old mechanic who had lived in the region his entire life without incident. The freezing rain began to fall against the glass of his remote cabin as the sun dipped behind the ridges. Neighbors later reported seeing his porch light flickering through the dense fog that settled into the valley that evening. Investigators never confirmed what drew him toward the edge of the woods during the peak of the winter storm. Dispatch logs from the county sheriff department indicate a call was placed from the Miller residence at 10:42. The operator heard only the sound of heavy wind and the rhythmic ticking of a clock in the background. 2 officers arrived at the property 30 minutes later to find the front door standing open to the freezing air. They found a single set of boot prints leading away from the porch and into the thick brush. State records show that Thomas had no history of wandering, and his vehicle remained parked in the gravel driveway. The interior of the home appeared undisturbed, with a warm meal still sitting on the wooden kitchen table. Search teams arrived at daybreak to find the tracks ended abruptly near a limestone outcrop known as the Devil's Throat. Some locals claimed they heard a low humming sound echoing through the trees during the early morning hours. Forensic teams examined the area but found no evidence of a struggle or any secondary sets of footprints. Archived notes from a similar event in 1984 suggest the ground in that area is prone to instability. The official report noted that the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees, which made survival unlikely without proper winter gear. Investigators remained baffled by the lack of physical clues left behind in the fresh snow and frozen mud. A county file from 2009 mentions strange acoustic anomalies reported by hikers near that specific mountain ridge. The records conflict regarding whether these sounds are caused by wind or by underground caverns shifting in the cold. Thomas's family maintained that he was a cautious man who would never venture out into a storm. His disappearance remains an open case with the local authorities, who still conduct occasional sweeps of the deep forest. The town of Hinton remembers that night as a reminder of how quickly the mountains can claim a life. No body was ever recovered, and the mechanic's tools still sit untouched in his quiet workshop. The search expanded to the surrounding hollows, where the terrain becomes nearly impassable for those without deep local knowledge. Volunteers from 3 neighboring counties joined the effort, but the record cold temperatures forced many to retreat by nightfall. State records indicate that air heat signatures were impossible to detect due to the thickness of the hemlock canopy. Some locals claimed that the silence in the woods that week was unnatural, even for a West Virginia winter. Investigators never confirmed if Thomas had any reason to leave his home without his heavy winter coat or boots. The boots he wore were reportedly his lighter work pair, which left shallow impressions in the hardening icy crust. By the 7th day of the investigation, the sheriff department noted several discrepancies in the initial witness statements. One neighbor insisted they saw a second figure standing near the tree line, but the dispatch logs mentioned no intruders. Archived notes from the local historical society describe deep vertical shafts in the limestone that are not on modern maps. These shafts were allegedly used for ventilation during the mining boom of 1922, but were never properly sealed. Records conflict on the exact location of these openings, which makes any ground search extremely dangerous for the recovery teams. The case file remains active, though no new physical evidence has surfaced in the decades since Thomas vanished. A secondary witness named Sarah Jenkins worked as a nurse at the county hospital located 20 miles from the scene. She reportedly told investigators that she saw a man matching the description of Thomas walking near Route 20. This sighting occurred nearly 3 hours after the initial 911 call was placed from the empty cabin in the woods. State records from that night show that the road was completely blocked by fallen timber and deep snowdrifts. Investigators never confirmed how a man on foot could travel that distance through a blizzard in such a short time. Some locals claimed the man she saw was actually a hunter who had been stranded in the same storm. Dispatch logs from 2017 show that a backpack was found by a group of surveyors in a creek bed. The item was heavily weathered and contained a set of keys that belonged to a Ford truck from 2012. Records conflict on whether these keys were ever tested against the vehicle still sitting in the Miller driveway today. Archived notes from the lead detective suggest that the backpack was actually dropped there much later than the disappearance date. Forensic analysts found no biological material on the straps or inside the pockets, despite the item being outdoors for years. This piece of evidence only added to the growing list of contradictions surrounding the cold case in West Virginia. The topography of the region around Hinton is famous for its hidden caves and vast networks of underground drainage systems. Investigators never confirmed if the limestone outcrop near the cabin was connected to a larger subterranean complex beneath the ridge. Some locals claimed that they saw lights moving deep within the woods for weeks following the official search suspension. State records indicate no authorized personnel were in the area during those specific nights due to the extreme weather conditions. A county file from 2021 notes that several pets went missing from the same neighborhood that winter. These events were reportedly dismissed by the authorities as typical predator activity common in the Appalachian wilderness. Thomas Miller was described by his coworkers as a man of habit who rarely deviated from his daily mechanical routine. He was 32 years old and had planned to move to a larger city the following spring. Records conflict regarding his mental state during the final weeks leading up to the Valentine's Night disappearance in 2016. Some neighbors mentioned he had grown increasingly quiet, while others reported he seemed excited about his upcoming career change. Investigators never confirmed any history of depression or a desire to walk away from his life without a word. The cabin remains empty, and the surrounding forest continues to grow over the paths where he was last seen. A retired state trooper named Robert Vance revisited the site 3 years later to conduct his own private investigation. He reportedly discovered a series of markings carved into the trees roughly 2 miles north of the Miller property line. Archived notes from his journal describe the symbols as geometric patterns that did not match local trail markers or logging codes. Some locals claimed these marks were simply the work of bored teenagers looking to create a urban legend in the woods. Investigators never confirmed if these carvings were fresh or if they had been present during the original search in 2016. The wood was deeply scarred and showed signs of being etched with a very sharp, heavy metallic instrument. State records from 1955 detail a similar disappearance involving a timber scout who vanished in the same square mile. The scout was a 40-year-old veteran who was intimately familiar with the weather patterns of southern West Virginia. Dispatch logs from that era mention a search that lasted for 3 weeks before being officially called off by the governor. Investigators never confirmed a connection between the two cases, despite the identical nature of the footprints ending at the limestone. Some locals claimed that the ridge holds a specific magnetic charge that interferes with compasses and modern navigation equipment. This theory was reportedly tested by a university team in 2018, but the results remained entirely inconclusive. The county file from 2019 includes a testimony from a local pilot who flew over the ridge that winter. He reportedly saw a dark circular patch in the snow where the heat seemed to have melted the ice completely. Records conflict on whether this was a natural thermal vent or something related to the abandoned mining infrastructure below. Investigators never confirmed the coordinates of the patch because the snow covered it again before a ground team could arrive. Archived notes from the Geological Survey state that there are no known volcanic or thermal activities in that part of the state. The pilot insisted that the circle was perfectly symmetrical and roughly 30 feet in diameter according to his altimeter. In the spring of 2022, a heavy flood washed away a portion of the riverbank near the Miller cabin. A local fisherman found a rusted metal box caught in the roots of an old sycamore tree 3 miles downstream. The box reportedly contained several handwritten letters dated from February 14, 1999, but the ink was mostly illegible. Investigators never confirmed if these letters belonged to a previous tenant or were related to the disappearance of Thomas Miller. Some locals claimed the handwriting matched a local schoolteacher who had moved away from the region decades prior to the event. The county file indicates that the box was logged as found property and sits in a storage locker today. Thomas Miller's mother still lives in a neighboring town and refuses to believe her son simply walked into the woods. She reportedly receives phone calls on Valentine's night that consist of nothing but static and the sound of distant wind. Records conflict on whether these calls originate from a local landline or a spoofed digital number from outside the country. Investigators never confirmed the source of the signals because they usually last for less than 5 seconds before the line cuts. Some locals claimed it is a cruel prank played by people who know the tragic history of the Miller family. Archive notes from the telecom provider show that the calls often coincide with local power surges in the valley. The mystery of Thomas Miller remains one of the most discussed cold cases in the history of southern West Virginia law enforcement. No trace of his clothing or personal items has ever been found within the 5-mile radius of the limestone outcrop. State records indicate that the case will remain open until physical remains are identified through DNA testing or dental record comparison. Some locals claimed they still see a light in the window of the cabin during the month of February each year. Investigators never confirmed these reports as the property has been disconnected from the electrical grid for over 7 years now. The mountain stands silent as a monument to a night that changed the small town of Hinton forever. In this news story, something watched our campsite all night in the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachian Mountains hold a history of strange disappearances that the local park rangers rarely discuss with the general public. Griffin Holloway worked as a professional wildlife photographer who specialized in documenting rare bird species in the remote mountain wilderness. He was 34 years old, and he had spent the last decade traveling through the most isolated mountain ranges. In October of 1998, he decided to travel to a remote section of the Blue Ridge Mountains area. His goal for the trip was to photograph the rare northern goshawk during its peak migration through the hardwood forest. He arrived at the trailhead during a particularly cold afternoon when the wind was beginning to howl through the trees. Griffin packed his professional equipment, including a heavy tripod and a specialized long lens for his high-end film camera. He hiked 4 miles into the backcountry before he decided to set up a small camp near a stream. The area was quiet, and the nearest paved road was a full day of hiking away from his current location. He built a small fire and he cooked a simple meal before the sun began to set behind the peaks. As the light faded, he felt a sudden and very distinct sensation that someone was standing just beyond the forest. He turned his flashlight toward the shadows, but he saw only the twisted branches and the thick blankets of moss. Griffin shrugged off the feeling and he climbed into his sleeping bag to get some rest for the early morning. He woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of something heavy moving slowly around the outer perimeter. The movement was calculated and deliberate, as if the intruder was trying to avoid making any unnecessary noise on the protection. Griffin reached for his flashlight and he sat perfectly still while his heart hammered against his ribs in the dark. He heard a low and gravelly sound that resembled a person trying to clear their throat from a great distance. The photographer slowly unzipped the tent flap and he peered out into the misty clearing where the fire had died. He saw a pair of pale eyes reflecting the moonlight from behind a large oak tree about 20 feet away. The eyes remained perfectly stationary, and they did not blink even when he shone his bright flashlight directly at them. Griffin felt a surge of adrenaline, and he shouted a warning into the darkness to see if anyone would respond. There was no reply from the woods, and the eyes eventually vanished into the thick undergrowth without making a sound. He did not sleep for the rest of the night, and he kept his knife close to his hand until, when the sun finally rose, he began to inspect the area around his tent for any signs of the visitor. He found a set of tracks that looked like bare human feet, but the toes were unusually long and thin. Griffin decided to conduct a formal investigation by setting up a series of motion-activated cameras around the campsite area. He spent the entire afternoon carefully hiding the lenses behind piles of brush and inside the hollow trunks of trees. He used a specialized high-speed film that was designed to capture clear images in very low light conditions indeed. While he was working, he found a discarded leather glove that did not belong to him near the creek bed. The glove was extremely old, and the leather had been stitched together with a material that looked like dried vine. He placed the glove in a plastic bag and he made a note of the exact location in his journal. That evening, he did not light a fire because he wanted to remain as inconspicuous as possible in the. He sat in his tent with a pair of night vision goggles and he watched the tree line for movement. At midnight, he saw a group of 3 tall figures emerge from the shadows near the edge of the. They did not move like humans, but they walked with a rhythmic and swaying motion that was very unsettling too. One of the figures approached the spot where he had placed the motion-activated camera, and it stood perfectly still. It reached out a hand that had unusually long fingers, and it gently touched the lens of the expensive camera. The figure was at least 7 feet tall, and it was covered in a layer of matted and gray hair. Griffin realized that these beings were not interested in his food or his supplies, but were curious about his tools. They began to mimic the way he had moved earlier in the day by walking in a slow and deliberate. One of the figures picked up a small rock, and it held the stone to its eye like a camera. Griffin felt a deep sense of dread as he watched the creatures study his behavior with a high level. He realized that they had been watching him since he first entered the woods 3 days ago on the trail. The photographer remained in his tent, and he prayed that the creatures would not decide to enter his small shelter. After an hour of observation, the figures retreated back into the woods, and the forest became eerily silent once again. Griffin waited until the first light of dawn before he gathered his gear and began the long hike back. He moved as quickly as he could, but he constantly looked over his shoulder to see if he was followed. He reached the ranger station in the late afternoon, and he asked to speak with the senior officer on duty. The ranger was a man named Silas Thorne, who had worked in the Appalachian Mountains for over 30 years total. Griffin described the figures and the way they had mimicked his movements during the long night at the remote camp. Silas listened to the story with a grim expression, and he did not seem surprised by the details of the ranger explained that there were several reports of these beings dating back to the late 1800s on Rosette. He referred to them as the observers, and he said they were a group of feral people who lived. According to the archives, the observers did not attack hikers, but they were known for stealing items to use for. Silas showed Griffin a collection of items that had been recovered from abandoned camps over the last few decades of. The collection included rusted cameras and broken binoculars that had been carefully wrapped in animal skins and tied with vines. The ranger warned Griffin that the observers were becoming more bold and were starting to follow people closer to town. Griffin realized that the glove he found was likely a piece of clothing that the beings had tried to. The photographer returned to his home, but he could not stop thinking about the pale eyes in the dark forest. He processed the film from his motion-activated cameras, and he found several clear shots of the tall gray figures. The images showed the beings standing in a circle and looking directly into the camera lens with a curious expression. One of the figures was wearing the leather glove he had found near the creek bed earlier in the day. Griffin decided to share his findings with a local university professor who specialized in Appalachian history and human behavior. The professor examined the photos, and he suggested that the observers were a remnant of an ancient and isolated community. He believed that they had lost the ability to speak, but had developed a highly advanced system of visual mimicry. The university launched a small expedition to the area, but they found no trace of the observers It seemed as though the beings knew they were being hunted, and they had moved deeper into the mountain range. Griffin never returned to that section of the woods, but he still keeps the photos in a locked desk. He sometimes hears a rhythmic tapping on his window at night, and he wonders if they have finally found. The Appalachian Mountains are a place where the past and the present often collide in ways that we cannot understand. Griffin Holloway eventually retired from wildlife photography, and he moved to a quiet town far away from the dark woods. He often tells his story to other hikers as a warning to always be aware of their surroundings. He knows that there are things in the mountains that do not want to be mapped or understood by. The legend of the observers continues to grow, and more people report seeing the pale eyes in the forest. Some people say that the beings are guardians of the wilderness, while others believe they are something much more. The ranger station still keeps a file on the disappearances, but the official cause is always listed as accidental. Griffin believes that the observers are still out there and they are still watching the people who enter the D. He remembers the way the figure held the rock to its eye, and he knows they are still learning. The mountains hold their secrets tightly, and they do not give them up to anyone who is not invited. Every October, he looks at the mountains and he remembers the night he was studied by the Silent Watchers. The investigation into the leather glove revealed that the stitching was made from a rare type of mountain orchid root. This plant only grows in the highest and most inaccessible parts of the mountain range near the rocky peaks. This discovery suggested that the observers had a deep knowledge of the local flora and how to use it. Griffin realized that the beings were far more intelligent than he had initially believed when he first saw them. He spent his final years writing a book about the experience, but he never published the final and most. He died in 2024, and he left his collection of photos to the local historical society in town. The researchers who studied the images found that the observers were often visible in the background of his earlier. It appeared that they had been following him for years before he ever noticed their presence in the dark. This realization changed the way the community viewed the forest and the people who lived in the mountain shadows. The mystery of the Appalachian observers remains unsolved, and the files are still open at the local sheriff office. The town of Blackwood remains a quiet place, but the residents always lock their doors when the sun goes down. They know that the mountains are not just rocks and trees, but are home to something that is still. Silas Thorne occasionally visits the old trailhead, and he leaves a small gift of fruit or cloth on the day. He says it is a way to keep the peace between the town and the beings who live above. Some people laugh at him, but others bring their own offerings to the edge of the dark and thick. The forest seems to accept these gifts, and the number of disappearances has decreased significantly over the last few. Griffin Holloway is buried in a small cemetery that overlooks the peaks he once loved to photograph so much. His headstone has a small carving of a camera and a single pair of eyes watching from the bottom. People who visit the grave often report feeling as though they are being observed from the trees near the prom. It is a fitting tribute to a man who spent his life looking at things that did not want. The Appalachian Mountains continue to stand tall, and they keep their secrets hidden beneath the canopy of the green. The final recording Griffin made before he left the mountains was a simple description of the silence in the coding. He said that the woods were not truly quiet, but were filled with the sound of 1,000 heartbeats. He believed that the mountain was one large organism, and the observers were its eyes and its long ears. This theory was never proven, but it remains a popular topic among the local hunters and the forest rangers. The film from the motion-activated cameras is now stored in a climate-controlled vault to preserve the images. Many people have tried to find the clearing where Griffin camped, but the trails have changed over the years. It seems as though the mountain has moved the path to protect the beings who live in the shadows. Silas Thorne says that some things are not meant to be found by those who do not belong there. He still patrols the lower trails, but he never goes above the ridgeline after the sun has set. He knows that the observers are still there, and they are still waiting for the next person to... The story of the Appalachian Watchers is a reminder that we are never truly alone when we are outside. In this new story, 3 disturbing small-town horror stories. Part 1. The town where nobody locked their doors. Most people in the American heartland believe that absolute trust is a sign of a healthy and safe community. This account from a remote mountain village suggests that leaving your front door unlatched might be an invitation for disaster. In the isolated village of Blackwood Hollow, the local culture was built on the fact that no one locked doors. Harlan Reed was a 41-year-old postal carrier who walked the quiet streets of the Hollow every afternoon. He had lived in the town since 1982, and he knew the specific habits of every single neighbor. The locals believed that their safety was guaranteed by the surrounding mountains and the long history of their shared ancestors. Harlan enjoyed the predictability of his route because it allowed him to finish his work before the early winter darkness. He often dropped off packages directly inside the mudrooms of the elderly residents who could not easily reach their porches. This level of trust was the foundation of the town, and no one ever questioned the safety of the practice. The atmosphere began to change during the first week of November in the year 2021 without any warning. Harlan was delivering a heavy box to a Victorian-style home owned by a woman named Mrs. Gable, who lived. He pushed the front door open as he had done for 15 years, but he felt a sudden and sharp. The house was silent, and the air inside felt significantly colder than the crisp autumn breeze blowing through the yard. He called out for Mrs. Gable, but his voice seemed to be absorbed by the heavy curtains and thick rugs. He noticed that the furniture in the living room had been moved into a tight circle facing the front door. This was strange because the elderly woman was known for her obsession with keeping her home in a perfect state. Harlan left the package on the floor and stepped back outside because he could not shake the feeling of... He mentioned the odd encounter to the local sheriff named Silas Thorne while they were eating lunch at the diner. Silas suggested that the woman was simply redecorating for the upcoming holiday season in the Hollow, but Harlan remained. By the middle of the following week, Harlan noticed similar patterns in several other homes along his daily delivery route. Doors were standing wide open even when the temperature dropped below freezing, and the residents were nowhere to be seen. He stopped at the home of a young mechanic named Elias Vance, who was usually working in his garage. The garage was empty, and the tools were scattered across the concrete floor as if they had been dropped suddenly. Harlan walked to the back door and found it unlatched and swinging slowly in the damp and heavy wind. He entered the kitchen and saw 3 plates of steaming hot food sitting on the small wooden table in silence. The family was gone, but the television was still playing a local news broadcast from a city 50 miles away. He felt a sense of vertigo as he realized the residents had not simply walked away from their homes. Harlan decided to conduct his own investigation because the authorities seemed disinterested in the strange behavior of the quiet town. He returned to the post office and began to look through the historical archives of Blackwood Hollow from many decades. He found a series of newspaper clippings that described a similar event that occurred in the winter of 1950. Several families had disappeared from their homes overnight, leaving behind open doors and half-eaten meals on their dining tables. The reports mentioned that the only witness was a young boy who spoke about a tall figure wearing a hat. This figure reportedly walked through the streets and knocked on every door that was not properly secured with a bolt. Harlan realized that the current residents were following a tradition that they did not fully understand or even remember. They left their doors open because they believed it kept them safe from the thing that wanted to enter. He spent the next 3 nights watching the main street from the window of his small apartment above the pharmacy. The town was deathly quiet, and the only sound was the howling of the wind through the dark mountain passes. On the 3rd night, he saw a dark shape moving slowly between the houses on the far side of town. The figure was remarkably tall and wore a tattered coat that seemed to blend into the shadows of the trees. Harlan watched in horror as the figure approached the front door of the local grocery store and pushed it open. The figure emerged a few minutes later and moved toward the next house with a purposeful and steady gait. The next morning, he went to the grocery store to see if the owner, named Arthur, was still there. Arthur was sitting in the middle of the aisle, staring at the ceiling with a look of pure and absolute. He did not respond when Harlan called his name or when he shook him gently by the heavy coat. Harlan realized that the town was being harvested by something that used the open doors as an invitation to enter. The residents were not being taken by force, but were surrendering to a force they could not possibly hope. He returned to his apartment and finally did the one thing that no one in the town had ever. He closed his front door and turned the heavy brass deadbolt until he heard a loud and satisfying click. The scratching started at exactly midnight and continued for several hours as the entity circled the small and dark apartment. Harlan could hear the heavy breathing of the thing on the other side of the thin wooden door in silence. It whispered his name in a voice that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves in a very deep. The deadbolt held firm, and the scratching eventually stopped as the sun began to rise over the cold mountain. He finally gathered the courage to open the door and walk out into the streets of the hollow once more. The town was completely empty, and there was no sign of the residents or the tall figure in the. The open doors were still swinging in the wind, but the houses were now hollow shells of their former selves. The police files confirmed that 100 people disappeared without a single trace of a struggle or a crime. Harlan Reed still lives in a city where every door is locked, and he never forgets the open doors. The mystery remains as deep as the woods and as old as the fear of the dark and the. This story serves as a reminder that some traditions are actually chains that bind us to a very dark. The silence of Blackwood Hollow is the only legacy left behind for those who chose to leave doors open. Part 2. Everyone heard screams. Nobody called the police. Most violent crimes happen in the shadows of the night when no one is around to witness the actual struggle. This story is different because it happened in the middle of a crowded neighborhood where every single person was listening. The bystander effect is a documented phenomenon where people fail to help when others are present in a large group. In the autumn of 2021, a small community in Ohio learned how dangerous this silence can truly be. Vance Whitaker was a 45-year-old retired machinery operator who lived in a brick apartment complex in Ohio. He liked the quiet nature of the suburbs because it allowed him to focus on his gardening and local woodcraft. On the night of October 12, 2021, he was sitting in his living room watching a classic film. The complex was designed with a central courtyard where residents often gathered to talk during the warm summer months now. At approximately 10 o'clock that night, a piercing scream echoed through the courtyard and vibrated against the thin glass windows. Vance paused his movie and looked toward the window, but he did not see any movement in the dark shadows. He noticed that the moonlight was casting long and jagged shapes across the brick walls of the apartment buildings tonight. He assumed it was just a group of teenagers playing a prank or perhaps a loud television in another unit. He waited for several minutes for a second sound, but the courtyard remained deathly silent under the dim yellow lights. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and the lingering smell of charcoal from a nearby grill. He decided to go back to his movie and ignored the nagging feeling that something was wrong in the complex. Another scream rang out 10 minutes later, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps running across the wet pavement below. Vance stood up and walked to his balcony, but he could only see the silhouettes of his neighbors looking out. No one was shouting for help, and no one was running outside to investigate the source of the terrifying noise. He saw the lights in the apartment across the way flicker on and then off as if someone was watching. Vance felt a sense of relief because he assumed his neighbors were already calling the police to report the disturbance. He sat back down on his worn leather sofa and tried to focus on the dialogue of the old film. The screaming stopped after 30 minutes and was replaced by the low hum of the wind through the courtyard trees. He went to bed shortly after midnight, convinced that the situation had been resolved by the local authorities already today. The next morning, he woke up to the sound of sirens and saw several police cruisers parked in the lot. Yellow crime scene tape was draped across the entrance to the courtyard where he had heard the screams last night. He walked outside and saw a group of his neighbors standing together with looks of deep confusion and mounting guilt. A detective named Silas Thorne began to knock on every door to ask if anyone had heard anything unusual recently. Vance told the detective about the screams and mentioned that he thought someone else had already called the emergency line. The detective looked at his notepad and informed Vance that not a single person in the complex had called them. There were 48 occupied units in the building, and every single resident admitted to hearing the screams that night. They all gave the same excuse that they assumed someone else would take the responsibility for calling the police now. The victim was a 30-year-old woman named Elena Vance, who worked as a night shift nurse nearby today. She had been attacked while walking from her car to the front door of her building in the open air. The investigation revealed that the attacker had stayed in the courtyard for over an hour because he knew no one. He had moved with a calculated slowness because he realized the neighbors were watching but doing nothing to stop him. The forensic team found several discarded cigarette butts near the bushes where the attacker had waited for his next move. The most disturbing part of the case was the realization that the screams were not actually coming from Elena Vance. The detective found a small digital recorder hidden in the bushes that was programmed to play a loop of screams. The attacker had used the recording to desensitize the neighbors and see if anyone would actually step outside to help. Elena had been taken in total silence while the neighbors were distracted by the loud and artificial noise in courtyard. The police found her car door wide open and her keys still hanging from the lock in the driver's side. The twist in the investigation came when they reviewed the security footage from a camera hidden in the lobby area. The man who planted the recorder was not a stranger, but a resident who lived on the third floor now. His name was Julian Reed, and he was a quiet 38-year-old accountant who never caused any trouble. He had spent weeks studying the habits of his neighbors to ensure that his psychological experiment would work perfectly today. Julian did not want to kill anyone, but he wanted to prove that the community was built on false trust. He had taken Elena to a nearby warehouse and left her there safely to show how easy it was. The police found Elena unharmed, but the psychological damage to the residents of the complex was permanent and very deep. Every person who lived in that building eventually moved away because they could no longer look at their neighbors' faces. Vance Whitaker left Ohio a month later and moved to a small cabin where he did not have any neighbors. He realized that the silence of the woods was much safer than the silence of a crowd of indifferent people. The case remains a chilling reminder that we cannot always rely on others to do the right thing in moments. If you hear a scream in the night, you should be the one who makes the call to the police. The ending of this story sounds fake, but the police records confirm the strange details of the social experiment today. Some people want to watch the world burn, and others just want to watch their neighbors do absolutely nothing now. Local psychologists often cite the Blackwood Hollow incident as the perfect example of how urban isolation affects our basic instincts. It remains a mandatory case study for university students who are learning about the complex nature of human social behavior. The recorded screams are still kept in a secure evidence locker at the police station as a grim historical artifact. People who move into the complex today are never told about the night that everyone listened to the darkness alone. Vance Whitaker sometimes looks at the old news clippings and wonders if he would do anything differently if it happened. The silence of the neighborhood was a choice that 48 people made together without ever saying a single word. The world is full of sounds, but the most important ones are often the ones that we choose to ignore. Part 3. The family everyone avoided. Most people who live in the rural corners of northern Maine understand that privacy is a very respected local tradition. There was one specific household on the edge of the woods that made even the most hardened loggers feel uneasy. Beckett Lowry was a 45-year-old carpenter who supposedly moved into the old Miller estate in the winter. He was joined by his wife Alara and their young daughter Maisie, who was rarely seen playing in the yard. The neighbors noticed immediately that the family never traveled into town to buy groceries or supplies like a normal family. They would only see the three of them standing at the edge of the dark forest during the late evening. The Lowry family stood perfectly still for hours while staring into the dense trees as if they were waiting there. No one in the small community ever dared to knock on their door or offer a warm welcome to the quote. The local mail carrier, named Arthur, was the only person who had any regular contact with the strange Miller property. He noticed that the grass in the front yard never seemed to grow despite the heavy rain of the spring. The windows of the house were always covered with thick black fabric that prevented anyone from seeing the interior rooms. In the summer of 1997, Arthur noticed that the mailbox was overflowing with letters and local circular advertisements. He walked up the porch steps and felt a sudden drop in temperature that made his skin crawl with dread. He looked through a small gap in the window fabric and saw the three family members sitting at the table. They were not eating or talking, but were simply staring at the front door with wide and unblinking pale eyes. Arthur dropped the mail and ran back to his truck because the silence from the house felt like a... He reported the strange incident to the local sheriff named Silas Thorne, who had been patrolling the area for years. Silas was a practical man who did not believe in local legends or the whispered fears of the nervous townspeople. He agreed to perform a welfare check on the Lowry family to ensure that no one was sick or hurt. The sheriff drove to the estate the following morning and found the front door was standing wide open and unlatched. He stepped inside the foyer and was immediately struck by the thick layer of dust covering every single piece of. It looked as if no one had lived in the house for at least 30 years despite the recent sightings. He walked into the kitchen and found the three family members sitting exactly where Arthur had described them the day. The sheriff approached Beckett Lowry and touched his shoulder, but the man did not move or respond to the contact. Silas realized with a shock that the bodies were not alive, but were perfectly preserved and very realistic wax figures. He searched the rest of the house and found a collection of old newspaper clippings hidden under the floorboards. The articles described a family named Lowry who had disappeared from a different state in the year 1967. The photographs in the newspapers matched the faces of the wax figures sitting in the kitchen with terrifying and exact. Silas found a journal in the basement that described a man who wanted to recreate his lost family forever today. The writer had spent decades building the figures and moving them around the yard to simulate a normal and living crumb. The neighbors had not seen a real family, but had been watching a grieving man move statues in the dark. The investigation revealed that the real Beckett Lowry had died of natural causes in the basement several months prior today. His body was found resting near a workbench filled with sculpting tools and various jars of heavy industrial grade. The mystery of why the neighbors saw the figures standing on their own remains a topic of local debate now. Some people believe the grief was so strong that it left a permanent stain on the old Miller estate grounds. The house was eventually torn down, but people still avoid the empty lot where the family used to stand. The forest is quiet now, and no one stands at the edge of the trees during the late evening hours. It is a reminder that the things we avoid are often much sadder than the monsters we usually imagine. The police files confirm that the Lowry family was never actually in the state of Maine during that time.